Welcome to Crime Stories for Sleep. Tonight, before we begin, I want to ask you something simple. Where are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? Think about that quietly, let the question settle, and when you're ready, allow yourself to drift into the story. The fluorescent lights in the basement of the municipal building cast everything in a pale, steady glow that never changed, regardless of whether the sun had risen or fallen above the city streets. Detective Sarah Chun had grown accustomed to this artificial twilight during her years working the night shift, but tonight felt different somehow. Perhaps it was the way the silence seemed to press against the walls, or how the dust motes danced lazily through the stagnant air. Catching the light like tiny suspended secrets, she moved through the narrow corridors between filing cabinets, her footsteps muffled by the worn carpet that had absorbed decades of similar journeys. The archive stretched endlessly in both directions, row after row of metal shelving that reached toward the low ceiling, each section labeled with years that stretched back further than most people could remember. The city's memory lived here, preserved in manila folders and typed reports, witnesses to events that had long since faded from public consciousness. The case file she carried tonight bore the number 1987 to 4421, its edges soft with age and handling. Inside, 43 pages detailed an investigation that had consumed months of someone's life, filled with photographs that had yellowed at the corners and witness statements typed on machines that no longer existed. The paper felt fragile beneath her fingertips, as though it might crumble if she held it too tightly. Taking its secrets with it into dust dot at her desk in the corner of the archive room, Chun opened the file and began to read. The first page was a standard incident report, filled out in the careful handwriting of an officer whose name appeared in dozens of other files from that era. Officer Martinez had possessed remarkably neat penmanship, she noticed, each letter formed with deliberate precision that suggested patience and attention to detail. His reports always began the same way, with the date and time written in the upper right corner, followed by a brief summary of the call that had brought him to the scene on the night of September 15, 1987. At 11:47 p.m., Martinez had responded to a noise complaint on Maple Street. The caller, whose name was blacked out in accordance with privacy regulations, had reported hearing what sounded like furniture being moved in the apartment above theirs, followed by a series of loud crashes. When Martinez arrived at the 3-story brownstone, he found the building quiet, its windows dark, except for a single light glowing behind drawn curtains on the second floor. Chin could picture the scene easily, having walked those same streets countless times during her own patrols. Maple Street in the late 1980s would have been lined with mature elm trees, their branches creating patterns of shadow and light beneath the street lamps. The brownstones stood shoulder to shoulder, their brick facades worn smooth by decades of weather, each building identical except for the small details that marked them as separate homes, different door colors, varying styles of window boxes, the occasional wind chime hanging from a fire escape. Martinez's report continued with methodical precision. He had knocked on the door of apartment 2B, waited the customary 30 seconds, then knocked again. When no one answered, he had spoken with the downstairs neighbor, Mrs. Eleanor Vasquez, who confirmed that she had called in the complaint. She described the sounds as distinctly unusual. Not the typical footsteps or conversation one might expect from an upstairs neighbor, but something heavier, more deliberate. The detail that caught Chun's attention wasn't what Martinez had found, but how he had described finding it. His words carried a weight that went beyond simple police procedure, a careful attention to atmosphere that suggested he understood the importance of preserving not just the facts of what had occurred, but the feeling of the moment itself. When he wrote about the silence that had settled over the building after the disturbance, Chun could sense his awareness of how unusual that quiet had been, how it seemed to hold its breath in the aftermath of whatever had caused Mrs. Vasquez to reach for her telephone. the investigation had stretched across several weeks. Each day documented in reports that grew increasingly detailed as the case developed complexity. Chun found herself drawn into the rhythm of the investigation, following Martinez and his partner, Detective Raymond Torres, as they methodically interviewed neighbors, collected statements, and filed paperwork that created a paper trail through the city's bureaucratic maze. What emerged from the pages wasn't a story of dramatic revelation or sudden breakthrough, but rather a slow accumulation of small details that painted a picture of ordinary life interrupted by something indefinable. The tenant of apartment 2B, a man named David Hoffman, worked night shifts at the printing plant downtown. His neighbors described him as quiet, polite, the sort of person who nodded hello in the hallway, but rarely engaged in extended conversation. He paid his rent on time, kept his music low, and had lived in the building for nearly 3 years without causing any problems. Yet, something had changed in the weeks leading up to that September night. Mrs. Vasquez mentioned to Martinez that she had noticed her upstairs neighbors. Footsteps had become more frequent in recent weeks, pacing back and forth across his apartment at odd hours. The tenant across the hall, Mr. Kim, had observed that Hoffman had started receiving more mail than usual. Thick envelopes that arrived without return addresses and were collected quickly from the mailbox in the building's lobby. Chun turned the pages slowly, allowing herself to sink into the methodical pace of the investigation. There was something deeply soothing about the way these old reports unfolded, their careful documentation of routine police work that built understanding one small piece at a time. Unlike the urgent cases that dominated her current workload, these archived investigations had the luxury of thoroughness, the patient accumulation of detail that created a complete picture of people and places and moments in time. The photographs in Hoffman's file were black and white, shot with the kind of camera that required careful consideration of light and angle. Chun studied them closely, noting the way the photographer had captured not just the evidence, but the atmosphere of the scenes. Hoffman's apartment had been neat, almost sparse, with furniture arranged in careful right angles and surfaces free of clutter. The living room contained a single couch, a coffee table, and a bookshelf lined with paperbacks that appeared to be primarily mystery novels and technical manuals related to printing processes. In the bedroom, the bed had been made with military precision, its corners sharp and its surface smooth. A single photograph sat on the nightstand, showing Hoffman with a woman whose face had been carefully blacked out in the file copy. The original photographer had captured enough of the image to suggest it had been taken outdoors, possibly in a park, with trees visible in the background and sunlight creating a warm, golden atmosphere that contrasted sharply with the stark emptiness of the apartment. Martinez's reports grew more detailed as the investigation progressed. He had spoken with Hoffman's supervisor at the printing plant, a man named Frank Sullivan, who had known Hoffman since he started working there. Sullivan described Hoffman as reliable, punctual, and skilled at operating the complex machinery that produced the city's newspapers and commercial printing jobs. He worked the overnight shift, arriving at 10 p.m. and leaving at 6 a.m., a schedule that had remained consistent for all 3 years of his employment. But Sullivan had noticed changes too. In recent weeks, Hoffman had seemed distracted during work, making small errors that were uncharacteristic for someone of his experience and attention to detail. He had also begun taking his breaks alone, rather than joining the informal gatherings of workers who would share coffee and conversation during the quiet hours of the night shift. When Sullivan had asked if everything was all right, Hoffman had assured him that he was simply dealing with some personal matters that would resolve themselves soon. Asterisk. Chun found herself wondering about those personal matters as she continued reading through the file. The investigation had revealed that Hoffman had no local family, having moved to the city from a small town 3 hours away after finishing technical school. He had few close friends, maintaining what appeared to be a deliberately solitary existence that left little trace in the social fabric of the city. His bank records, obtained through proper legal channels, showed a pattern of regular deposits from his paycheck and modest withdrawals for basic living expenses. Only irregularity that Martinez and Torres had discovered was a series of money orders that Hoffman had purchased in the months leading up to his disappearance. The amounts were small, never more than $200 at a time, but they occurred with regularity every 2 weeks. The money orders had been made out to different names, all of them sending funds to addresses in the same small town where Hoffman had grown up. The investigation into these money orders had led Martinez on a trip back to Hoffman's hometown, a journey documented in a report that Chun found particularly compelling. Martinez wrote about the drive through increasingly rural landscape, past farms and forests that seemed untouched by the urbanization that had transformed the city. The town itself was small enough to walk from end to end in less than an hour. Its main street lined with businesses that had remained largely unchanged for decades. The local police chief, a man named William Burke, who had held the position for over 20 years, remembered Hoffman and his family well. The Hoffmans had been one of the town's founding families, owning and operating a successful farming operation for several generations. David's father, Robert Hoffman, had been a respected member of the community until his death in a farming accident when David was 17 years old. The accident had been tragic but straightforward. Robert had been working alone in a field when his tractor had overturned, crushing him beneath its weight. But Chief Burke's recollections revealed complications that hadn't been apparent at the time. In the months following Robert's death, questions had arisen about the family's financial situation. The farm had been mortgaged heavily, and Robert had taken out several loans using the property as collateral. When he died, the debt had become the responsibility of his widow, Margaret Hoffman, and their son David. The insurance settlement from Robert's death had covered some of the debt, but not all of it, leaving the family in a precarious financial position. David had left town shortly after graduating from high school, ostensibly to attend technical school and prepare for a career that would allow him to support his mother. Margaret had sold the farm to pay off the remaining debts, using what little money remained to move into a small apartment in town. According to Chief Burke, she had become increasingly reclusive in the years following her husband's death, rarely venturing out except for necessary errands and maintaining contact with only a few close neighbors that the money orders Martinez had discovered were being sent to Margaret Hoffman at her apartment address. When he had visited her, she had been cooperative but reserved, answering his questions with the careful politeness of someone who had learned to be wary of unexpected visitors. She confirmed that she had been receiving regular financial support from her son, money that helped supplement her small Social Security payments and allowed her to maintain her independence. But Margaret's description of her recent communications with David didn't match the timeline that Martinez had established through his investigation in the city. She claimed to have spoken with him by telephone just 2 days before Martinez's visit, describing a conversation in which David had assured her that he was well and that his work at the printing plant was going smoothly. Yet the building superintendent at David's apartment complex had not seen him for over a week, and his supervisor at the plant reported that he had not shown up for his scheduled shifts during that same period. Chun paused in her reading, noting how Martinez had handled this discrepancy in his report. Rather than drawing immediate conclusions or speculating about what it might mean, he had simply documented the conflicting information and continued with his methodical investigation. This patience, she reflected, was one of the qualities that separated truly skilled investigators from those who allowed urgency to compromise thoroughness. The search of David's apartment, conducted with proper warrants and witnessed by the building superintendent, had revealed few additional clues. His personal belongings appeared undisturbed, his clothes remained in the closet, and his refrigerator contained food that was still fresh. The only items that seemed to be missing were his work boots, a leather jacket that neighbors had seen him wearing regularly, and a small canvas bag that he typically carried too. And from the printing plant, Martinez had also discovered a collection of letters hidden beneath David's mattress. Correspondence that painted a more complex picture of his relationship with his mother. The letters, written in Margaret's careful script, revealed a woman struggling not just with financial difficulties, but with profound loneliness and a sense of guilt about the burden she felt she had placed on her son by accepting his financial support. In one letter, dated just 3 weeks before David's disappearance, Margaret had written about her concern that David was sacrificing too much of his own life to take care of her needs. She encouraged him to consider dating, to make friends, to build the kind of social connections that would enrich his life beyond the routine of work and family obligation. She also mentioned that she had been thinking about her husband's death more frequently, wondering whether there were details about the accident that she had never fully understood. This last comment had prompted Martinez to request the original accident report from Chief Burke, a document that filled several additional pages in David's file. The investigation into Robert Hoffman's death had been thorough for a small-town police department, including photographs of the accident scene, measurements of skid marks and debris patterns, and interviews with neighbors who had discovered the overturned tractor. But reading through the accident report 25 years later, Martinez had noticed details that might have seemed insignificant at the time, but that took on different meaning in the context of David's disappearance. The tractor had been found in a section of field that Robert rarely worked alone, according to his farming neighbors. The weather on the day of the accident had been clear and dry, conditions that should have made the work routine and safe. Most puzzling, the tractor's emergency brake had been found in the released position. Though Robert was known for his careful attention to safety procedures, Chun realized she had been reading for nearly 2 hours without pause, drawn into the hypnotic rhythm of Martinez's methodical investigation. The archive room around her had grown quieter as the night deepened, the building settling into the profound silence that came when even the cleaning staff had finished their work and gone home. She could hear the distant hum of the building's heating system, a steady white noise that seemed to underscore the timeless quality of the stories preserved in these files. The investigation into David Hoffman's disappearance had continued for several more weeks, following leads that grew increasingly tenuous as time passed. Martinez and Torres had expanded their search to include neighboring cities, checking with hospitals, shelters, and other police departments for any sign of David or the personal items that had disappeared with him. They had also worked with the Postal Service to monitor the delivery of mail to his apartment, hoping that someone might attempt to contact him or that he might return to collect important documents. But as autumn had turned to winter, the active investigation had gradually transformed into a cold case. Its files moved from active drawers to the archive shelves where Chun now sat. The final report in David's file, dated December 15, 1987, bore the signatures of both Martinez and Torres, along with their supervising lieutenant, acknowledging that all reasonable investigative avenues had been exhausted and that the case would remain open but inactive pending the discovery of new evidence. Chun closed the file and sat quietly for a moment, allowing the story to settle in her mind like sediment in still water. There was something profoundly peaceful about these archived cases, their urgency transformed by time into a kind of historical meditation on the mysteries that touched ordinary lives. David Hoffman had vanished into the space between one day and the next, leaving behind questions that no amount of careful investigation had been able to answer definitively. She looked around the archive room, noting how the rows of filing cabinets stretched away from her desk like a forest of metal trees, each one containing dozens of similar stories. The city's history was preserved here in fragments, case files that documented moments when normal life had been interrupted by events that demanded official investigation and careful documentation. Some of the cases had been resolved quickly, their files thin with straightforward reports and clear conclusions. Others, like David's, remained thick with accumulated detail and unanswered questions. The clock on the wall showed that it was nearly 3 a.m., the hour when the city reached its deepest point of quiet. Chun gathered David's file and returned it to its proper place on the shelf, noting how it fit seamlessly back into the row of similar folders, distinguished only by its case number and the small tab that bore David's last name in Martinez's precise handwriting. Tomorrow, or perhaps years from now, another investigator might pull the same file and experience, the same slow immersion into the details of David's life and disappearance. As she prepared to leave the archive room, Chun paused at the door and looked back at the endless rows of files. Each one represented someone's story, someone's moment of intersection with the official machinery of justice and investigation. Most of the people whose names appeared on those file tabs had returned to their ordinary lives after their encounters with the police department, their cases closed and their questions answered. But others, like David Hoffman, remained suspended in the amber of official documentation, their stories preserved but not concluded. The elevator that carried her back up to the main floor of the building moved slowly, giving her time to transition from the timeless atmosphere of the archives to the present moment of her shift. Above ground, the city continued its restless sleep, streetlights casting pools of yellow illumination on empty sidewalks, traffic signals cycling through their colors for audiences of empty intersections. It was the hour when the night shift workers moved through their routines in hospitals and factories and radio stations, maintaining the essential services that kept the city functioning, even when most of its residents were asleep. Chun walked to her patrol car, noting how the cool night air carried the mixed sense of the city, exhaust from the few vehicles still on the roads, the dampness that rose from storm drains, the faint smell of coffee from an all-night diner several blocks away. These were the familiar markers of her working hours, the sensory landscape that had become as familiar to her as daylight was to people who worked. Conventional schedules. As she drove through the quiet streets, Chun found herself thinking about the patterns that connected David's case to dozens of others she had encountered during her years of police work. People disappeared for many reasons, some dramatic and criminal, others mundane and personal. They left behind jobs and apartments and responsibilities, sometimes planning their departures carefully, other times acting on impulses that even they might not have fully understood. But David's disappearance felt different to her, marked by a quality of deliberation that suggested careful thought rather than sudden decision. The missing work boots and jacket indicated practical preparation for departure. The missing canvas bag suggested that he had taken essential personal items with him. Yet the undisturbed apartment and the fresh food in the refrigerator created an impression of sudden abandonment that contradicted the signs of planned departure. The radio in her patrol car crackled occasionally with routine communications between dispatchers and other officers, brief exchanges that documented the ordinary work of maintaining order in the sleeping city. A domestic disturbance call on the east side resolved peacefully. A minor traffic accident with no injuries and minimal property damage. An alarm at a convenience store that turned out to be triggered by a malfunctioning sensor rather than criminal activity. These calls reminded Chun of the continuous flow of events that generated the case files housed in the basement archives. Every night, officers like her responded to situations that required official documentation, their reports becoming part of the permanent record that future investigators might someday examine. The vast majority of these reports would never be revisited, their contents absorbed into the administrative memory of the department and forgotten by everyone except the people directly involved. But some cases, like David's, possessed a quality that made them linger in the consciousness of the investigators who worked them. Perhaps it was the unanswered questions, or the sense that important details remained hidden beneath the surface of what had been officially documented. Or perhaps it was simply the human tendency to be haunted by mysteries, to continue wondering about outcomes. Long after practical investigation had reached its limits, Chun found herself driving the streets near David's former apartment building, though she couldn't have explained exactly why. Maple Street looked much the same as it would have in 1987. Its brownstones maintained but aged, their brick facades weathered by decades of additional seasons. The elm trees that had once lined the sidewalks had been replaced by younger maples, their branches not yet mature enough to create the canopy of shadows that Martinez would have walked beneath during his investigation. The building where David had lived showed signs of recent renovation, its windows replaced and its front entrance updated with modern security features. But the basic structure remained unchanged, and Chun could easily imagine Martinez climbing the same stairs to apartment 2B, knocking on a door that might have been painted a different color but that opened onto rooms where David had arranged his furniture with military precision and maintained a life of deliberate solitude. She parked across the street and sat quietly in her patrol car, engine running to maintain the heat, radio turned down low enough to allow her to hear the subtle sounds of the neighborhood at rest. Occasionally, a cat would cross the street in the purposeful manner of animals with nighttime territories to patrol. A few windows glowed with the blue light of televisions, suggesting residents who, like her, found themselves awake during the hours when sleep should have claimed them. The building's current tenants would know nothing of David Hoffman or the night in September 1987 when he had made whatever decision had led to his disappearance. His story had become part of the building's hidden history, preserved only in the archive files and in the memories of investigators who had long since retired or moved on to other cases. The apartment where he had lived would have been repainted and recarpeted, occupied by a succession of new tenants who brought their own stories and left their own traces in the building's ongoing narrative. Chun realized that this was part of what drew her to the archive cases, the way they revealed the layered history that existed beneath the surface of ordinary places. Every building, every street corner, every routine location in the city contained multiple stories, some documented and some lost, some resolved, and some suspended forever in states of mystery and speculation. The city was a palimpsest, its current reality written over traces of everything that had come before. As dawn began to approach, Chun drove slowly back toward the station, following a route that took her past other locations from David's file. The printing plant where he had worked still operated, though under different ownership and with updated equipment that had replaced the mechanical presses he would have known. The post office where he had purchased his money orders had been renovated, but remained in the same location. Its Art Deco facade a reminder of an earlier era's architectural aspirations. These places had continued to function and change during the decades since David's disappearance, their daily operations unaffected by the mystery that had once centered on their role in his routine. The people who currently worked in these buildings would be unaware that their workplace had once been part of an active police investigation, its details carefully documented in reports that now resided in basement archives. This anonymity struck Chun as both melancholy and oddly comforting. The city possessed a kind of forgiveness, allowing the stories of its residents to fade naturally into the background as new stories took their place. The dramatic events that seemed so important at the time they occurred eventually became simply part of the continuous flow of urban life, remembered primarily in official records that few people would ever have reason to examine. Back at the station, Chun completed the paperwork for her shift, noting the quiet night and the absence of any significant incidents requiring detailed documentation. Her reports would join the thousands of others that filled the filing cabinets, contributing to the ongoing record of the city's nights and the people who moved through them. In a few hours, the day shift would arrive and the building would fill with the sounds of phones and conversations and the routine business of law enforcement. But for now, in the hour before sunrise, the station maintained the same quality of suspension that Chun had found in the archive room. Time seemed to move differently in these spaces, less urgently and with more attention to the weight of accumulated experience. The stories preserved in the files were like sedimentary layers, each one adding to the depth of the city's memory and creating a record that stretched back through decades of human experience. As she prepared to end her shift, Chun thought about David Hoffman one more time, wondering where the passage of 37 years had taken him. If he had chosen to disappear, he would now be an older man, his life shaped by experiences that remained completely unknown to the investigators, who had once worked so hard to understand his story. If his disappearance had been involuntary, then his story had ended in ways that the archived files would never be able to document. But in either case, his presence in the archive ensured a kind of permanence that transcended the immediate questions surrounding his fate. Martinez's careful reports had preserved not just the details of the investigation, but something of David's life itself, his neat apartment, his reliable work habits, his quiet care for his mother, his connection to a small town, and a family history that reached back through generations of farming and community life. These details created a portrait that was more complete in some ways than the pictures of people whose lives had never intersected with police investigation. The necessity of official documentation had captured aspects of David's existence that might otherwise have been known only to him, preserving them in a form that would remain accessible as long as the city maintained its archives. Chun gathered her things and walked toward the exit, noting how the building had begun to stir with the earliest preparations for the day shift. Security guards were completing their final rounds. Cleaning staff were emptying waste baskets and preparing to lock up equipment. Dispatchers were updating logs and preparing briefing materials for their replacements. The transition from night to day was gradual in a police station, marked more by changes in activity level than by any dramatic shift in atmosphere. Outside, the sky was beginning to show the first pale hints of dawn, though the street lights remained on and the city maintained its nighttime appearance. Chun had always found this transitional hour particularly peaceful, when the night shift was ending, but the day had not yet begun in earnest. It was a time that seemed to exist outside the normal flow of urban schedules, a pause between the activities that defined the city's waking and sleeping hours. As she drove home, through streets that were just beginning to show signs of early morning activity, Chun reflected on the way the archived cases had become a source of unexpected comfort to her. Reading through the old investigations provided a sense of continuity that connected her current work to the efforts of previous generations of officers, creating a feeling of participation in something larger and more enduring than any individual case or career. The stories in the files were like chapters in a book that was still being written, each investigation adding to a narrative about the city and its people that stretched across decades. Some chapters had clear conclusions, others ended in mystery, but all of them contributed to a record that captured something essential about the experience of living in a place where millions of individual stories intersected and influenced each other in ways both obvious and subtle. David Hoffman's story was one thread in that larger narrative, significant not because it had been resolved, but because it had been carefully preserved. Martinez's reports ensured that David's life would not be forgotten entirely, that his connection to the city and its history would remain accessible to future investigators and to anyone else who might have reason to wonder about the people whose stories had become part of the official record. This preservation struck Chun as a form of immortality, different from the kind achieved through fame or accomplishment, but no less real. The archived files created a space where the details of ordinary lives could persist indefinitely, protected from the natural tendency of memory to fade and facts to become distorted over time. In the climate-controlled environment of the basement archives, David's story would remain as complete and accurate as it had been on the day Martinez had signed his final report. As she pulled into her driveway, Chun noticed that the newspaper had already been delivered, its plastic wrapper beaded with morning dew. The printing plant where David had worked would have played a role in producing that newspaper, just as it had contributed to the daily rhythm of information and communication that connected the city's residents to each other and to the larger world. The work that David had done during his night shifts had been part of that essential infrastructure, helping to maintain the flow of words and images that informed and entertained the city's population. Inside her house, Chun moved through her end-of-shift routine with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to transition between the nocturnal world of police work and the daytime world of personal life. She prepared a simple breakfast and sat by her kitchen window, watching as the neighborhood gradually awakened around her. Children would soon be walking to school along the sidewalks where she had patrolled during the night, their voices and laughter replacing the silence that had accompanied her through the empty streets. This daily transformation never failed to remind her of the city's resilience, its ability to renew itself continuously through the activities of its residents. The same streets that had seemed mysterious and potentially dangerous during her night patrols would soon be filled with the ordinary business of daily life, people walking their dogs, commuting to work, running errands, participating in the countless small interactions that created the social fabric of urban existence. David Hoffman had once been part of this daily renewal, his work at the printing plant contributing to the information flow that helped coordinate the city's activities, his rent payments and purchases supporting the economic relationships that sustained his neighborhood, his regular telephone calls providing comfort and connection to his mother in their small hometown. His absence from these networks had created a vacancy that others had eventually filled, but the fact of his participation had been preserved in the archive files, creating a permanent record of his place in the city's history. As she prepared for sleep, Chun found herself grateful for the archive room and the stories it contained. The old cases provided a kind of perspective that was difficult to find in the urgency of current investigations, reminding her that every case was part of a larger pattern of human experience that extended beyond the immediate questions of guilt and innocence, cause and effect. The files were repositories of compassion as well as information, preserving not just the facts of what had happened, but something of the lives that had been touched by events significant enough to require official documentation. Sleep came easily to Chun that morning, aided perhaps by the peaceful atmosphere she had absorbed during her hours in the archives. Her dreams, when they came, were filled with images of quiet streets and patient investigators, of carefully filed reports and stories that continued long after their official conclusions had been reached. In those dreams, the city revealed itself as a vast library of human experience, its every building and street corner containing narratives that connected the present to the past and the individual to the community. The archive room waited in the basement of the municipal building, its climate-controlled silence preserving thousands of stories like David Hoffman's, each one a thread in the larger tapestry of the city's memory. Tomorrow night, or perhaps weeks or months from now, another investigator would descend those stairs and select a file, allowing themselves to be drawn into the patient rhythm of archived investigation and the timeless questions that connected past mysteries to present understanding. In the quiet hours of another night shift, another story would unfold from the pages of careful reports and faded photographs, revealing once again the hidden depths that existed beneath the surface of ordinary urban life. The city would continue its restless sleep, hiding its secrets beneath layers of silence, while the archives preserved those secrets for anyone patient enough to read them and wise enough to understand their enduring significance. The report filing system at the municipal police department had evolved over decades into something approaching an art form, though few people would have recognized the aesthetic qualities inherent in its methodical organization. Detective Lieutenant Maria Santos had overseen the records division for 12 years, and during that time she had developed an appreciation for the subtle beauty found in properly maintained documentation. Each report represented a moment when the messy complexity of human behavior had been translated into the precise language of official procedure, creating documents that served simultaneously as legal evidence, administrative records, and inadvertent literature. On this particular Wednesday evening in late October, Santos sat at her desk in the records processing room, surrounded by the day's accumulation of incident reports, follow-up documents, and supplementary filings. The fluorescent lights overhead cast everything in the same steady illumination that had become as familiar to her as natural sunlight was to people who worked conventional hours. Outside, the city moved through its evening routines. But here in the records division, time was measured not by the rising and setting of the sun, but by the steady accumulation of paperwork that documented the endless intersection of law enforcement with daily life. First report in her current stack bore the case number 20247832, filed by Officer Jennifer Walsh at 3:47 p.m. that afternoon. Walsh had been called to investigate a complaint about vandalism at the Riverside Community Center, a modest brick building that had served the neighborhood for over 30 years. The complainant, Margaret Chun, served as the center's volunteer coordinator and had discovered the damage when she arrived that morning to open the building for the day's activities. Santos read through Walsh's description of the scene, noting the officer's methodical attention to detail that transformed what might have been a routine property damage report into a careful study of place and circumstance. Walsh had photographed the vandalism from multiple angles, documenting not just the spray-painted words that had been scrawled across the building's front entrance, but the context in which they appeared, the carefully maintained flower beds that flanked the doorway, the bulletin board protected by glass that announced upcoming community events, the worn but clean sidewalk that suggested regular maintenance and community pride. The vandalism itself consisted of 3 words spray-painted in red across the double doors of the main entrance. Walsh had included the exact text in her report, along with measurements indicating that the letters stood approximately 8 inches tall and had been applied using what appeared to be standard aerosol paint. The words were misspelled, suggesting either haste during their application or limited literacy on the part of whoever had created them. More significantly, the paint appeared fresh, with sharp edges and no signs of weather damage, indicating that the vandalism had occurred recently, possibly during the previous night. Walsh had interviewed Margaret Chun at length, documenting not just the facts of the discovery, but Chun's emotional response to finding her workplace damaged. Chun had worked at the community center for 7 years, first as a part-time employee and later as a volunteer after her retirement from the school district. She described the building as a second home, a place where neighborhood children came for after-school programs, where senior citizens gathered for social activities, where families celebrated birthdays and anniversaries in the modest but well-maintained event rooms. The interview revealed that this was not the first incident of vandalism at the center. Over the past 6 months, there had been 3 previous episodes: spray paint on the rear wall facing the parking lot, broken windows in the gymnasium, and graffiti on the playground equipment behind the building. Each incident had been reported to the police and documented in separate case files, but no pattern had been immediately apparent, and no arrests had been made. Santos cross-referenced the case numbers that Walsh had noted in her report, pulling the files for the previous incidents and spreading them across her desk. The earlier reports had been filed by different officers, but all followed the same methodical format that translated observed facts into standardized language. Reading through them in sequence created a timeline of escalating problems that seemed to target the community center specifically, rather than representing random acts of vandalism in the broader neighborhood. The first incident, documented in case file 20243156, had occurred in early May. Officer Robert Kim had responded to a call about graffiti on the building's rear wall. Finding several illegible tags that appeared to have been created with black spray paint, Kim had photographed the damage and interviewed the custodian who had discovered it, but had found no witnesses and no immediately obvious suspects. The graffiti had been painted over within days, and the incident had seemed isolated. 2 months later, case file 20244721 documented the broken windows in the gymnasium. Officer Susan Martinez had found 3 windows shattered, apparently by rocks or other projectiles thrown from the adjacent parking lot. The damage had occurred overnight, discovered by staff members arriving for work the following morning. Martinez's report included careful measurements of the window openings, photographs of the glass fragments scattered on the gymnasium floor, and interviews with neighbors whose homes faced the community center. None of the neighbors had seen or heard anything unusual during the night, despite the fact that breaking 3 large windows should have created considerable noise. The third incident, case file 2024-5984, had involved graffiti on the playground equipment. Officer David Torres had documented extensive spray painting on the swing sets, slides, and climbing structures that comprised the center's outdoor recreational area. Unlike the previous graffiti, this vandalism had included recognizable symbols and words, some of which suggested possible gang affiliation. Torres had photographed each piece of equipment separately, creating a comprehensive record of the damage that filled nearly 20 pages of his report. Santos noted how each officer had approached the documentation differently, yet all had maintained the same basic commitment to thoroughness that characterized good police report writing. Kim's report emphasized the physical evidence, with detailed descriptions of paint colors, surface textures, and weather conditions that might have affected the vandalism. Martinez focused on the mechanics of the window breaking, including trajectory analysis based on the scatter patterns of glass fragments. Torres had concentrated on the symbolic content of the graffiti, researching the meaning of various tags and consulting with gang intelligence officers to determine whether the vandalism represented territorial marking. Reading through these reports in sequence, Santos began to see patterns that might not have been apparent when each incident was considered in isolation. The escalation was clear, from illegible tags to property destruction to symbolic messaging that suggested more organized intent. The timing also showed a progression, with longer intervals between the earlier incidents and shorter gaps as the pattern developed. Most significantly, all 4 incidents had occurred on weekends, when the community center was closed and the surrounding area was less likely to have witnesses. Welsh's current report included additional information that connected the latest incident to broader community concerns. Margaret Chun had mentioned during her interview that several other neighborhood organizations had experienced similar problems in recent months. The public library 3 blocks away had been vandalized twice. The elementary school had reported graffiti on its exterior walls, and the small park at the end of Riverside Avenue had been damaged repeatedly despite increased police patrols. This information prompted Santos to expand her research beyond the community center files. She accessed the department's database and searched for vandalism reports filed in the same geographic area over the past year, creating a map of incidents that revealed a pattern of systematic targeting of community institutions. The vandalism was not random or opportunistic, but appeared to represent a deliberate campaign against places that served as gathering points for neighborhood residents. The database search produced 17 additional case files, each documented with the same methodical attention to detail that characterized all police reports. but each also revealing small pieces of a larger picture that became clear only when viewed collectively. Santos printed out the relevant pages and arranged them chronologically on her desk, creating a timeline that showed the gradual expansion of vandalism from isolated incidents to a coordinated pattern of property damage and intimidation. Asterisk. The earliest incident in the expanded timeline dated back 14 months, involving graffiti at the neighborhood's small branch post office. Officer Amanda Rodriguez had documented the discovery of spray-painted symbols on the building's brick facade. Symbols that Rodriguez had photographed and described in detail, despite their apparent meaninglessness. The report included measurements, color descriptions, and weather information. Following department protocols for property damage documentation, reading Rodriguez's report with the benefit of hindsight and additional context, Santos could see elements that might have seemed routine at the time, but that took on different significance as part of the broader pattern. The symbols Rodriguez had documented were similar to those that Torres would find on the playground equipment more than a year later. The spray paint colors matched those used in several of the subsequent incidents. Most telling, the vandalism had been discovered on a Monday morning, suggesting it had been applied during the weekend when the post office was closed and the surrounding area was quiet. The methodical progression through the case files created a hypnotic rhythm of official documentation, each report following the same basic structure while revealing unique details about specific times and places. Santos found herself drawn into the careful language of police procedure, the way that trained observers translated chaotic reality into organized information that could be filed, cross-referenced, and preserved indefinitely. Officer Patricia Young's report on case 2023-8847 documented vandalism at the neighborhood elementary school, filed 11 months before the current community center incident. Young had discovered extensive graffiti on the school's main entrance, applied in multiple colors and including both symbols and text. Her photograph showed damage that covered nearly the entire front facade of the building, requiring professional cleaning services and partial repainting to remove completely. Young's interview with the school principal, Dr. Elizabeth Murphy, had revealed that this was part of an ongoing pattern of problems that included not just vandalism, but also trespassing, littering, and attempted break-ins. Murphy had expressed frustration with what she saw as an escalating threat to the school community, noting that parents were beginning to express concerns about their children's safety and that some families were considering transferring to schools in other neighborhoods. The principal's concerns, documented in Young's careful notes, provided insight into the psychological impact of vandalism that extended far beyond the simple cost of cleaning and repairs. The symbolic violence represented by graffiti and property damage created an atmosphere of insecurity that affected the entire community, changing the way people felt about places that had previously felt safe and welcoming. This transformation of community space was perhaps the real purpose of the vandalism, more significant than the surface damage that could be painted over or repaired. Santos continued through the chronological sequence of reports, noting how different officers had developed different approaches to documenting similar types of incidents. Some focused primarily on physical evidence, creating detailed catalogs of damage with precise measurements and photographic documentation. Others emphasized the human impact, conducting extensive interviews with victims, witnesses, and community members. Still others approached vandalism as a form of communication, attempting to decode the symbolic content of graffiti and understand the messages being conveyed through property damage. Case file 20239-234, documented by Officer Michael Thompson, involved vandalism at the neighborhood's small public library. Thompson had found graffiti covering the exterior walls, windows covered with spray paint, and the book return slot sealed with what appeared to be industrial adhesive. His report included not just documentation of the damage, but research into similar incidents in other jurisdictions, suggesting possible connections to organized vandalism campaigns that targeted educational and cultural institutions. Thompson's research had led him to contact police departments in neighboring cities, documenting similar patterns of systematic vandalism that seemed to move from one community to another over periods of months or years. His report included summaries of telephone conversations with other investigators, creating a network of information that extended the local case files into regional patterns of criminal activity. The library incident had been particularly significant because it had occurred during the day, while the building was open and staff members were present. Thompson had interviewed 3 librarians who had witnessed part of the vandalism, providing the first eyewitness accounts in the series of incidents. The witnesses described seeing 2 individuals working systematically around the building's exterior, one applying spray paint while the other appeared to serve as a lookout for approaching vehicles or pedestrians. The witness descriptions were frustratingly vague, limited by distance, poor lighting, and the brief duration of the observation. Both suspects were described as young adults, possibly teenagers, wearing dark clothing and baseball caps that obscured their faces. They had worked quickly and efficiently, suggesting familiarity with the building's layout and confidence that they would not be interrupted. When they noticed the librarians watching from inside the building, they had departed immediately, leaving behind half-finished graffiti and several cans of spray paint. Thompson had collected the abandoned spray paint cans as evidence, documenting their brand names, color specifications, and any fingerprints or DNA evidence that might be present. His report included detailed photographs of the cans and their contents, along with chemical analysis that might connect them to paint used in other incidents. This level of scientific documentation represented a significant investment of resources in what might otherwise have been considered a minor property damage case, reflecting the department's growing recognition that the vandalism pattern represented something more serious than random mischief. The evidence processing had revealed partial fingerprints on 2 of the spray paint cans, prints that were entered into the automated identification system for comparison with known offenders. The database search had produced no immediate matches, but the prints remained on file for future comparison should suspects be identified through other investigative methods. This created another layer of documentation, connecting the physical evidence to the larger information networks that law enforcement used to track patterns of criminal activity across time and geographic boundaries. Santos paused in her review of the case files to prepare a cup of coffee from the machine in the records division break room. The building around her had settled into the deep quiet of evening, with most of the day shift personnel having departed and only essential night shift operations maintaining activity in other parts of the facility. The records division occupied a kind of temporal middle ground, processing the day's accumulation of reports while preparing materials that would be needed by investigators and administrators. When they returned the following morning, the coffee provided a brief break from the intensive concentration required to process multiple case files simultaneously. But Santos found that her mind continued to work through the patterns and connections that were emerging from the documented incidents. The systematic nature of the vandalism suggested coordination and planning that went beyond spontaneous acts of rebellion or mischief. Someone was deliberately targeting community institutions, following a strategy that maximized psychological impact while minimizing the risk of detection and arrest. Returning to her desk, Santos opened case file 2024-1467, documented by Officer James Wilson following vandalism at the neighborhood's small community garden. Wilson had found extensive damage to the raised beds, greenhouses, and tool storage areas that volunteers had built and maintained over several years. The vandalism had included not just graffiti, but physical destruction of plants, equipment, and infrastructure that had required months of volunteer labor to create. Wilson's report revealed a different dimension of the vandalism pattern, one that went beyond symbolic messaging to include genuine economic damage that affected the daily lives of community members. The community garden provided fresh vegetables for dozens of families, particularly elderly residents and families with limited incomes who depended on the produce to supplement their grocery budgets. The destruction of mature plants and growing infrastructure represented not just property damage, but a disruption of food security that would affect the neighborhood for an entire growing season. The emotional impact of the garden vandalism was documented in Wilson's extensive interviews with community volunteers. Maria Gonzalez, who had coordinated the garden project for 3 years, described the destroyed plots as representing hundreds of hours of volunteer labor and significant financial investment by people who could afford neither. The vandalism had targeted not just the physical infrastructure, but the social networks and collaborative relationships that had made the garden possible. Wilson had photographed the damage systematically, creating a visual record that showed both the extent of the destruction and the care that had been invested in the original garden design. His photographs revealed raised beds built with precision and attention to detail, irrigation systems that had been installed with professional skill, and tool storage areas that reflected years of gradual improvement and expansion. The contrast between the evident care in the garden's construction and the deliberate destruction inflicted by the vandalism created a powerful visual narrative about the conflict between community building and community destruction. The investigation of the garden vandalism had produced the most substantial evidence collected in any of the related cases. Wilson had found footprint impressions in the soft soil of the growing beds, impressions that he had photographed and measured before having them professionally cast for permanent preservation. The footprints suggested at least 3 individuals had been involved in the destruction, working systematically through the garden over a period that must have lasted several hours. The extended duration of the garden incident raised questions about how such extensive vandalism could occur without attracting attention from neighbors or passing traffic. Wilson's report included a detailed analysis of the garden's location, noting that it was situated in a low-lying area that was not visible from surrounding streets and that was screened by mature trees that blocked sight lines from nearby residential areas. The isolation that made the location ideal for community gardening also made it vulnerable to vandalism that could proceed. UNOBSERVED. Santos cross-referenced the footprint evidence with similar evidence that might have been collected in other incidents, but found that most of the previous vandalism had occurred on hard surfaces that would not have preserved clear impressions. This made the garden incident potentially significant as a source of physical evidence that could connect suspects to the broader pattern of vandalism. Assuming that the same individuals were responsible for multiple incidents, the next case file in the chronological sequence, 20242893, documented vandalism at the neighborhood's small medical clinic. Officer Sarah Kim had responded to a report of graffiti and property damage that had been discovered by staff members arriving for work on a Monday morning. Kim's report described extensive spray painting on the clinic's exterior walls, along with damage to signs, windows, and outdoor equipment that had been vandalized with apparent deliberation and malicious intent. The clinic served as a community health resource, providing basic medical services, health education, and preventive care to residents who might not otherwise have access to health care. The vandalism had targeted not just the building's exterior, but also outdoor signs that provided information about services, clinic hours, and emergency contact numbers. The destruction of informational signage represented an attack on the clinic's ability to serve its patients, creating barriers to healthcare access that extended beyond simple property damage. Kim's interview with Dr. Rachel Martinez, the clinic's director, revealed that the vandalism was part of a broader pattern of problems that had been affecting the clinic's operations for several months. There had been incidents of harassment directed toward patients. Staff members had reported feeling unsafe when arriving early or staying late. And some patients had expressed reluctance to visit the clinic because of concerns about security and safety. Dr. Martinez's concerns, carefully documented in Kim's report, highlighted the way that vandalism and intimidation could undermine essential community services, even when the physical damage was relatively minor. The clinic's patients included many elderly residents, families with young children, and individuals dealing with chronic health conditions that required regular medical attention. Any disruption to the clinic's operations could have serious consequences for people who had limited alternatives for healthcare access. The medical clinic incident had occurred on the same weekend as vandalism at two other community locations, suggesting a coordinated campaign rather than isolated acts of property damage. Kim's report noted the timing correlation and recommended that investigators consider connections between the incidents. But the different responding officers and the routine processing of individual case files had initially prevented the pattern from being recognized. This coordination challenge was typical of the way that systematic criminal activity could escape detection when it was distributed across multiple cases and handled by different investigators. Santos realized their current review of the files was providing the first comprehensive overview of the vandalism pattern, revealing connections that had not been apparent when each incident was processed individually through normal case management procedures. Case file 202438789 documented the most recent incident before the current community center vandalism, involving damage to the neighborhood's small senior center. Officer David Chun had found graffiti covering the building's exterior, along with broken windows and damage to the building's handicap access ramp. The targeting of accessibility infrastructure suggested a particularly malicious intent, one that went beyond general property damage to specifically threaten the ability of disabled community members to access services. Chun's report included extensive documentation of the ramp damage, with photographs and measurements that showed how the vandalism had been designed to make the facility unusable for people with mobility limitations. The damage appeared calculated to maximize disruption while requiring expensive specialized repairs that would strain the senior center's limited budget. This level of strategic thinking suggested that the vandalism was not random, but was being planned by individuals who understood how to inflict maximum harm on community institutions. The senior center served as a crucial resource for the neighborhood's elderly residents, providing meal programs, social activities, transportation assistance, and connections to healthcare and social services. Many of the center's clients were isolated individuals for whom the facility represented their primary source of social contact and community connection. The vandalism threatened not just the building itself, but the social networks and support systems that had developed around the center's programs and services. Chun's interviews with senior center staff revealed that the vandalism had been particularly traumatic for elderly clients who remembered previous periods of neighborhood decline and who feared that the current problems represented the beginning of broader community deterioration. Several regular participants had stopped coming to the center after the incident, either because of mobility barriers created by the damaged ramp or because of general fears about safety and security in the area. The psychological impact on elderly residents was documented in Chun's follow-up interviews, creating a record of how vandalism could affect vulnerable community members in ways that extended far beyond the immediate physical damage. The fear and isolation experienced by senior center clients represented a form of secondary victimization that multiplied the harm caused by the original vandalism, creating ripple effects that touched multiple lives and Relationships. Santos completed her review of the chronological case files and sat quietly for a moment, allowing the accumulated information to settle in her mind like sediment in still water. The pattern that had emerged from the systematic documentation was clear. Someone was conducting a deliberate campaign against community institutions, using vandalism and property damage as weapons in a broader assault on neighborhood social infrastructure. The methodical progression through the case files had revealed not just the facts of individual incidents, but the larger story of how a community was being systematically undermined by people who understood the importance of shared spaces and services. The targeting was precise, focusing on institutions that brought people together, provided essential services, or created opportunities for collective action and mutual support. Each report represented hours of careful work by patrol officers who had documented the incidents according to department standards, creating a paper trail that preserved evidence and established legal foundations for potential prosecutions. But the reports also served as historical documents, preserving detailed records of a particular time and place when a community had come under attack by forces that remained largely invisible and unidentified. Language of police reports created its own hypnotic rhythm. The careful repetition of standardized phrases and procedural requirements that transformed chaotic events into organized information. Reading through multiple reports created a kind of meditation on the intersection between official procedure and human experience, revealing how trained observers could extract order and meaning from situations that might otherwise seem random or incomprehensible. Santos began the process of preparing his comprehensive summary report that would synthesize the information contained in the individual case files, creating a document that could guide future investigative efforts and resource allocation decisions. The summary would need to balance the detailed specificity of the individual reports with the broader patterns that emerged only when the cases were considered collectively. The work of creating summary documentation required a different kind of writing skill than that needed for individual incident reports, where patrol officers focused on specific observations and immediate facts. Supervisory personnel needed to identify trends, allocate resources, and coordinate activities across multiple cases and time periods. The summary report would serve as a bridge between the detailed work of street-level documentation and the strategic planning that guided departmental policies and priorities. As she worked on the summary, Santos found herself thinking about the community members whose stories were preserved in the case files. Margaret Chun at the community center, Dr. Martinez at the medical clinic, the elderly residents who depended on the senior center, the families who had invested time and energy in the community garden. These individuals represented the social fabric that the vandalism was attempting to destroy, the networks of mutual support and shared responsibility that made neighborhoods function as communities rather than simply collections of buildings and residents. The police reports documented not just criminal activity, but the resilience and determination of people who continued to maintain community institutions despite ongoing harassment and intimidation. Each incident report included evidence of community members who had cleaned up damage, organized repairs, and continued to provide services even when their safety and security were threatened. This persistence in the face of systematic attack represented a form of courage that was preserved in the official documentation alongside the facts of the criminal acts themselves. Summary report grew longer as Santos worked to capture not just the factual patterns revealed by the case files, but the human context that gave those patterns meaning and significance. The vandalism was not simply property damage, but an attack on the social infrastructure that allowed people to live together in mutual support and cooperation. Understanding this broader context was essential for developing effective responses that would address not just the immediate criminal activity, but the underlying threats to community stability and cohesion. As dawn approached, Santos completed her summary and prepared the case files for distribution to investigators, patrol supervisors, and community liaison officers who would use the information to guide their ongoing work. The night shift in the records division was ending, but the information preserved in the reports would continue to influence police work and community relations for months or years to come. Fluorescent lights that had illuminated her work through the night would soon be supplemented by natural sunlight streaming through the building's windows, marking the transition between night shift and day shift operations. But the work of documentation and analysis continued regardless of time of day, creating a continuous process of translation between the chaos of street-level events and the organized information that guided institutional responses and resource allocation decisions. Santos gathered the completed reports and filed them in their appropriate locations, ensuring that the night's work would be accessible to the day shift personnel, who would continue the process of investigation and community engagement. The careful organization of information was itself a form of community service, creating resources that would help future investigators understand patterns, solve cases, and protect the social institutions that made neighborhood life possible. Archive systems that preserved these reports would ensure that the detailed work of individual officers remained accessible across time and organizational changes, creating a permanent record of both criminal activity and community response that could inform future decision-making and policy development. In the climate-controlled silence of the record storage areas, thousands of similar reports waited to tell their stories. To anyone patient enough to read them and wise enough to understand their continuing relevance to the ongoing work of law enforcement and community protection. Asterisk. The basement storage facility beneath the municipal building extended much further than most employees realized, stretching through a maze of interconnected rooms that had been excavated and expanded over the course of several decades. Archivist Dr. Helen Morrison had spent the better part of 15 years mapping these underground spaces, cataloging their contents, and maintaining the environmental controls that preserved thousands of case files in climate-controlled silence. Her work took place in a world removed from the urgency of active investigations, where time was measured not by the demands of current cases, but by the slow processes of preservation and decay that affected all documents. Eventually, on this November evening, Morrison moved to the archive corridors with the measured pace of someone who had learned to find peace in the company of stored information. The overhead lighting in this section of the basement was older than in the main processing areas, casting a warmer, more subdued glow that made the endless rows of filing cabinets seem less institutional and more like the stacks of an ancient library. Each cabinet bore labels that marked not just its contents but its place in the chronological geography of the city's recorded history. The section Morrison was reviewing tonight contained files from the 1970s and early 1980s, cases that had been closed for decades and that were rarely accessed except for historical research or the occasional cold case review. These older files possessed a different quality than more recent documentation, their pages yellowed with age and their typing showing the distinctive characteristics of manual typewriters that had required physical force to imprint letters onto paper through carbon ribbons that sometimes produced uneven results. Asterisk. She paused at cabinet 1978C, running her fingers along the metal drawer pulls that had been opened and closed thousands of times over the past 45 years. The cabinet contained 47 case files from that year, each one representing a moment when someone's life had intersected with the official machinery of law enforcement in ways significant enough to require formal documentation. The files varied in thickness from single-page incident reports to multi-volume investigations that had consumed months of detective work and generated hundreds of pages of witness statements, evidence catalogs, and procedural documentation, Morrison selected file 1978 to 2341 at random. Noting how the manila folder had aged from its original buff color to a deeper amber that spoke of decades, spent in artificial light and controlled atmosphere. The file contained 83 pages, documenting an investigation into a series of residential burglaries that had occurred in the Mayco, Hillcrest neighborhood during the summer of that year. The investigation had been conducted by Detective Frank Kowalski, whose careful handwriting and methodical approach to documentation had created a comprehensive record of police work as it existed in an era before computers transformed the collection and analysis of evidence. The first page of Kowalski's report bore the date June 15, 1978, written in blue ballpoint pen in the upper right corner. According to department standards that had been established decades earlier, and that would remain unchanged for years to come. His description of the initial burglary began with the address 1247 Maple Avenue, followed by the time of the incident report, 8:23 a.m., and the name of the reporting officer, Sergeant William Murphy, whose signature appeared at the bottom of the page in the confident script of someone accustomed to signing official documents. The victim of the first burglary, Mrs. Dorothy Hennessy, had returned from a 3-day visit to her sister in Springfield to find her front door standing open and several rooms of her house disturbed. Murphy's initial report documented the scene with the careful attention to detail that characterized good police work in any era, noting which rooms had been entered, which items appeared to be missing, and which areas of the house seemed to have been left undisturbed by the intruders. Morrison read through Murphy's description of the crime scene, noting how his language captured not just the facts of what had been stolen, but something of the atmosphere of violation and intrusion that characterized residential burglary. Mrs. Hennessy's jewelry box had been emptied, its contents scattered across her bedroom dresser in a pattern that suggested hasty searching rather than careful selection. Her kitchen drawers had been pulled open and their contents dumped onto the floor, creating a chaos of utensils, papers, and household items that transformed the familiar space of daily life into something foreign and threatening. The photograph attached to Murphy's report showed Mrs. Hennessy's living room after the burglary, the black and white image capturing the aftermath of systematic searching that had left cushions overturned, books scattered from their shelves, and personal papers strewn across surfaces that had previously been organized according to the victim's daily routines. The photographer, whose name appeared in small print along the margin of each image, had documented not just the evidence of criminal activity, but the disruption of domestic order that represented the true cost of the invasion. Detective Kowalski had taken over the investigation 3 days later, when 2 additional burglaries in the same neighborhood suggested a pattern that required more sustained investigation than could be provided by patrol officers responding to individual incidents. His first report bore the date June 18, 1978, and began with a comprehensive review of the 3 known incidents, each documented with the same attention to procedural detail that would characterize his work throughout the investigation. The second burglary had occurred at 523 Oak Street, the home of Mr. and Mrs. Robert Chun, who had discovered the break-in when they returned from work on the evening of June 16th. Officer Patricia Williams had responded to their call and had documented a scene similar to the Hennessy burglary, with evidence of systematic searching and the theft of portable valuables including jewelry, cash, and small electronic items. Williams had photographed the damage and had interviewed the victims, creating a record that would become part of the larger investigative file when Kowalski assumed responsibility for the case. The third incident, at 892 Pine Street, had been discovered by Mr. James Rodriguez when he returned from his night shift job at the municipal water treatment plant. Officer David Kim had documented extensive damage to the rear door of Rodriguez's house, where the intruders had forced entry by prying the doorframe away from the jamb with what appeared to be a crowbar or similar tool. The physical evidence of forced entry had been more extensive than in the previous cases, suggesting either that the burglars had encountered more resistance or that they had been working with greater urgency. Morrison turned the pages slowly, allowing herself to be drawn into the methodical rhythm of Kowalski's investigation. His reports revealed a detective who understood that successful case resolution depended not on dramatic breakthroughs, but on the patient accumulation of small details that eventually revealed larger patterns. Each interview was documented completely. Each piece of physical evidence was photographed and cataloged. Each lead was followed to its conclusion regardless of how minor it might have seemed. Initially, the investigation had expanded. Over the following weeks as additional burglaries occurred in the Hillcrest neighborhood, each one adding to the growing file that documented not just individual crimes, but the systematic targeting of a specific geographic area. Kowalski's maps, hand-drawn on department letterhead and attached to his reports with paper clips that had left small rust stains after decades of storage, showed the progression of incidents across the neighborhood and revealed patterns that suggested the burglars possessed detailed knowledge of the area and its residents. By July, Kowalski had identified several commonalities among the targeted homes. All of the victims lived alone or in small households that were likely to be unoccupied during specific time periods. Most of the burglaries had occurred during daylight hours, when the perpetrators could work without the risk of encountering residents returning from work. The stolen items were consistently portable and valuable, suggesting that the burglars were working with a specific plan for disposing of the merchandise rather than taking items impulsively. The breakthrough in the case had come through the kind of methodical police work that rarely generated headlines, but that formed the foundation of most successful investigations. Kowalski had spent days canvassing pawn shops, secondhand stores, and other businesses that might serve as outlets for stolen merchandise. His reports documented dozens of conversations with shop owners, clerks, and customers, most of which produced no useful information, but all of which were carefully noted for future reference. On July 23, 1978, Kowalski had visited Reliable Jewelry and Loan, a small pawn shop on the east side of downtown that specialized in purchasing used jewelry, watches, and small electronics. The shop's owner, Mr. George Pappas, had shown Kowalski several items that matched descriptions from the burglary reports, including a distinctive antique brooch that had been described in detail by Mrs. Hennessy as a family heirloom with particular sentimental value. Pappas had maintained careful records of his transactions, as required by city licensing regulations, and had been able to provide Kowalski with detailed information about the individuals who had sold him the items. The seller had been a young man, probably in his early 20s, who had given the name Michael Sullivan and had provided an address in the Riverside neighborhood. Pappas had required identification for the transaction, as mandated by law, and had photocopied the driver's license that Sullivan had presented. Kowalski's follow-up investigation had revealed that Michael Sullivan was indeed a resident of the address provided to Pappas, but that he lived there with his older brother Thomas, who had a criminal record that included previous arrests for burglary and theft. The brothers shared a small apartment in a converted house that had been divided into multiple rental units, and they both worked occasional construction jobs that provided them with knowledge of residential neighborhoods and housing patterns. The surveillance that Kowalski had organized around the Sullivan brothers required careful coordination with patrol officers and detective personnel, and his reports documented the logistical challenges of maintaining observation while avoiding detection by the suspects. The surveillance had revealed that the brothers maintained irregular schedules, often leaving their apartment during midday hours and returning with small bags or packages that they carried directly inside without lingering in public areas where they might be observed. Morrison paused in her reading to examine the surveillance photographs that Kowalski had included in his reports. The black and white images, shot with telephoto lenses from concealed positions, showed the Sullivan brothers in various locations around the city, their faces clearly visible despite the limitations of 1970s photography equipment. The images had been developed and printed in the department's own photo lab, and they bore the careful labeling and dating that ensured their admissibility as evidence in legal proceedings. The arrest of Michael and Thomas Sullivan had occurred on August 8, 1978, when Kowalski and his partner Detective Raymond Torres had observed them in the process of burglarizing a house in the Hillcrest neighborhood. The arrest report documented a textbook example of police procedure, with the suspects apprehended in the act of committing a crime and found in possession of items that could be directly connected to previous burglaries. The evidence recovered from the Sullivan apartment had filled several boxes, each item carefully cataloged and photographed before being transported to the police property room for storage. Kowalski's inventory list included jewelry, electronics, cash, and personal items that had been stolen from 17 different burglaries over a period of 3 months. The systematic nature of the brothers' operation had been revealed through their careful organization of stolen merchandise, much of which they had stored in preparation for future sales to pawn shops and other outlets. The prosecution of the Sullivan case had proceeded smoothly, with both brothers eventually pleading guilty to multiple counts of burglary and theft. The case file included copies of the plea agreements, sentencing documents, and restitution orders that had required the brothers to compensate their victims for the property they had stolen and the damage they had caused. Michael Sullivan had been sentenced to 3 years in state prison, while Thomas, as the older brother with a previous record, had received a 5-year sentence. Morrison continued through the file, reading the follow-up reports that documented the return of stolen property to victims and the conclusion of the investigation. Kowalski's final report, dated September 15, 1978, included summaries of victim interviews conducted after the arrests, documenting the relief and satisfaction that residents felt when they learned that the burglars had been caught and that their neighborhood was no longer being systematically targeted. But the file also contained evidence of the lasting impact that the burglary series had on the Hillcrest neighborhood. Several victims reported in follow-up interviews that they had installed additional locks, security systems, and other protective measures that reflected their ongoing concerns about residential security. Some residents had changed their daily routines, avoiding leaving their homes unoccupied during the time periods when the burglaries had typically occurred. Mrs. Dorothy Hennessy, the victim of the first burglary, had provided Kowalski with a detailed statement about the long-term effects of the crime on her sense of security and well-being. Her description of feeling violated and unsafe in her own home was carefully documented in Kowalski's report, preserving a record of how property crime affected victims in ways that extended far beyond the simple loss of material possessions. The psychological impact documented in these victim statements represented an aspect of crime that was less visible than stolen property or physical damage, but no less real in its effects on individual lives and community relationships. The burglary series had transformed the Hillcrest neighborhood from a place where residents felt secure leaving their doors unlocked to a community where people invested in security systems and viewed strangers with suspicion. Morrison closed the Sullivan file and selected another from the same cabinet, this one bearing the number 1978 to 4156 and containing documentation of a different type of investigation entirely. The file was thicker than the burglary case, containing over 200 pages of reports, witness statements, and evidence documentation that had accumulated over the course of a 6-month investigation into financial fraud at a local investment firm. The complexity of the fraud investigation was immediately apparent from the organization of the file, which had been divided into multiple sections with colored dividers that separated different types of evidence and documentation. Detective Lieutenant Sarah Kim had supervised the investigation, working with a team of detectives, accountants, and federal investigators to unravel a scheme that had involved the systematic theft of client funds over a period of several years. The initial complaint that had prompted the investigation had come from Mrs. Helen Rodriguez, a retired school teacher who had invested her pension funds with Riverside Investment Services, a small firm that specialized in conservative investments for retirees and other clients seeking steady returns on their savings. Mrs. Rodriguez had discovered discrepancies in her monthly statements that suggested her account balances were significantly lower than they should have been based on her understanding of the investments that had been made on her behalf. Lieutenant Kim's initial interview with Mrs. Rodriguez had revealed a pattern of irregularities that extended beyond simple accounting errors. The investment statements provided by Riverside Investment Services showed transactions and fees that Mrs. Rodriguez had never authorized, and the explanations provided by the firm's representatives were inconsistent and evasive when she had attempted to get clarification about her account status. The investigation had expanded rapidly when Kim's inquiries revealed that Mrs. Rodriguez was not the only client who had experienced problems with Riverside Investment Services. The firm's records, obtained through court-ordered subpoenas, showed systematic discrepancies affecting dozens of client accounts, with patterns of unauthorized transactions and fee structures that appeared designed to transfer client funds to accounts controlled by the firm's principals. Morrison read through the financial documentation with the same careful attention she brought to all archived materials, noting how the investigators had translated complex financial transactions into clear, understandable language that preserved the essential facts while making the evidence accessible to prosecutors, judges, and juries who might not have specialized knowledge of investment practices. The fraud scheme had been sophisticated in its design, using legitimate investment transactions to disguise the systematic theft of client funds. The firm's principal, Robert Martinez, had created a network of accounts and shell companies that allowed him to move money between different entities while maintaining the appearance of legitimate business operations. The complexity of the scheme had required months of analysis by forensic accountants who had worked with police investigators to trace the movement of funds and document the mechanisms that Martinez had used to steal from his clients. The human cost of the fraud was documented in victim impact statements that filled an entire section of the file. Elderly clients who had trusted Martinez with their retirement savings had lost substantial portions of their financial security, forcing them to drastically alter their living arrangements and retirement plans. Some victims had been forced to return to work despite their age and health conditions, while others had become dependent on family members or social services programs that they had hoped never to need. Investigation had culminated in Martinez's arrest on 47 counts of fraud, theft, and conspiracy, charges that carried potential prison sentences totaling over 200 years. The evidence collected by Kim's investigation team had been sufficient to support successful prosecution, and Martinez had ultimately been sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, along with orders to pay restitution to his victims. But the restitution orders had proven largely meaningless, as Martinez had already spent or hidden most of the stolen funds in offshore accounts and investments that could not be recovered through legal proceedings. The victims' financial losses had been permanent, representing not just monetary damage but the destruction of retirement security that many elderly clients could never rebuild given their age and limited earning capacity. Morrison found herself drawn particularly to the witness statements provided by victims who described not just their financial losses, but their sense of betrayal and violation that came from being deceived by someone they had trusted with their life savings. These statements revealed the personal relationships that Martinez had cultivated with his clients, presenting himself as a trustworthy advisor who understood their needs and shared their values. The careful documentation of these relationships showed how financial fraud operated through the manipulation of trust and social connection, using the victim's own desire for security and stability as weapons against them. Martinez had targeted elderly clients specifically because they were likely to be trusting, less familiar with complex financial instruments, and unlikely to monitor their accounts closely enough to detect sophisticated theft schemes. The psychological impact of financial fraud was different from that of burglary or other property crimes, but no less devastating in its effects on victims' lives and well-being. The elderly clients who had been defrauded by Martinez faced not just financial hardship, but the knowledge that their own judgment and trust had been used against them by someone who had presented himself as their protector and advisor. As Morrison continued through the fraud file, she noted how the investigation had revealed broader problems in the regulation and oversight of small investment firms. Martinez had been able to operate his scheme for several years without detection by regulatory agencies that were supposed to monitor the investment industry and protect consumers from fraudulent practices. The regulatory failures documented in Kim's investigation had led to changes in oversight procedures and reporting requirements that were designed to prevent similar schemes from operating undetected for extended periods. But these policy changes had come too late to help Martinez's victims, who had already lost their savings and could not benefit from improved consumer protections. The Martinez case file concluded with follow-up reports that documented the difficulties that victims had experienced in rebuilding their financial security and the ongoing efforts by investigators to recover stolen funds through asset forfeiture and international cooperation with law enforcement agencies in jurisdictions where Martinez had hidden money. Morrison returned the fraud file to its proper location and selected a third case from the same time period, this one documenting an investigation into a series of assaults that had occurred near the downtown transit station during the fall of 1978. The assaults had targeted elderly pedestrians who were walking alone during evening hours, using a pattern of attack that suggested careful planning and selection of vulnerable victims. Detective Thomas Chun had investigated the assault series, working with transit police and other agencies to coordinate surveillance and patrol activities in the high-crime area. His reports documented a different type of police work than the burglary or fraud investigations, one that required close cooperation with community members and careful attention to the fears and concerns of residents who felt unsafe in their own neighborhood. The first assault had occurred on September 22, 1978, when 73-year-old Mrs. Margaret Walsh had been attacked while walking home from the bus stop after visiting her daughter in another part of the city. Mrs. Walsh had been knocked to the ground by an unidentified assailant who had stolen her purse and fled on foot before witnesses could intervene or provide assistance. Officer Maria Rodriguez had responded to the incident and had documented Mrs. Walsh's injuries, which included bruises and abrasions from her fall to the sidewalk, as well as the emotional trauma of being victimized by a stranger who had targeted her specifically because of her age and apparent vulnerability. Rodriguez's photographs of the crime scene had captured not just the physical evidence, but the context of isolation and poor lighting that had made the attack possible. The investigation had been complicated by the lack of witnesses and the brief duration of the assault, which had occurred so quickly that Mrs. Walsh had been unable to provide a detailed description of her attacker. Chun's reports documented his efforts to identify potential witnesses among people who regularly used the transit station area. But most of the individuals he interviewed had been focused on their own travel plans and had not noticed the assault until after it was over. The second assault had occurred 2 weeks later, following a similar pattern but with a victim who had been able to provide more detailed information about the attacker. Mr. James Kim, age 68, had been approached by a young man who had initially asked for directions before suddenly pushing him to the ground and stealing his wallet. Kim's description of the suspect had provided Chun with the first substantial lead in the investigation. Chun's interview with Kim had revealed that the suspect appeared to be a teenager or young adult, approximately 5 feet 8 inches tall, with dark hair and clothing that suggested he was familiar with street life and possibly homeless or transient. Kim had noticed that the suspect's shoes were worn and dirty, and that he had appeared nervous and agitated even before the assault occurred. The pattern of attacks had continued through October and November, with 5 additional incidents that followed the same basic approach: an initial contact that appeared innocent, followed by sudden violence and theft that was completed quickly enough to allow the suspect to escape before help could arrive. Chun's analysis of the incidents had revealed that all of the attacks had occurred within a 6-block radius of the transit station, during evening hours when lighting was poor and foot traffic was minimal. Morrison read through Chun's systematic documentation of each incident, noting how his reports captured not just the criminal acts themselves, but the growing fear and anxiety that the assault series had created among elderly residents who depended on public transportation for their mobility and independence. Many victims and potential victims had begun altering their travel plans, avoiding evening trips or arranging for family members to accompany them when they needed to use the transit station area. The community impact of the assault series was documented in Chun's interviews with social service providers, transit officials, and community leaders who had observed changes in behavior patterns among elderly residents. Senior centers reported decreased attendance at evening programs. Grocery stores near the transit station experienced reduced customer traffic during evening hours, and medical appointments were being rescheduled to avoid travel during the times when the attacks had typically occurred. The arrest in the case had come through the kind of persistent patrol work that characterized effective community policing. Officer Sandra Martinez, working an evening shift in the transit station area, had observed a young man whose behavior and appearance matched the suspect description provided by victims. Martinez had maintained surveillance of the suspect for nearly an hour before observing him approach an elderly woman in a manner consistent with the previous assault pattern. The arrest report documented how Martinez had intervened before the assault could occur, apprehending the suspect as he was in the process of initiating contact with his intended victim. The suspect, identified as Robert Johnson, age 19, had been found in possession of items that connected him to previous assaults, including identification documents that belonged to earlier victims, and that he had apparently kept his trophies of his crimes. Johnson's confession, obtained during questioning by Chen and recorded according to department procedures, had provided details about all 7 assaults and had revealed the thought processes that had guided his selection of victims and locations. Johnson had specifically targeted elderly individuals because he believed They would be unable to resist effectively and would be unlikely to pursue him if he escaped the immediate scene. The psychological evaluation that had been conducted as part of Johnson's prosecution had revealed a history of substance abuse, mental health problems, and previous criminal activity that had not been detected by the juvenile justice system. Johnson's attacks on elderly victims had been motivated not just by the desire for money, but by feelings of anger and powerlessness that he had, expressed through violence against people he perceived as vulnerable and defenseless. The sentencing in Johnson's case had included not just prison time, but requirements for psychological treatment and substance abuse, counseling that were designed to address the underlying problems that had contributed to his criminal behavior. The judge had also ordered restitution payments to victims. Though Johnson's lack of legitimate income and employment, history made it unlikely that the financial aspects of the sentence would provide meaningful compensation. Morrison noted how Chen's final reports had documented the relief that community members felt when Johnson was arrested and the gradual return to normal activity patterns among elderly residents who used the transit station area. But the case file also included evidence that the assault series had created lasting changes in community behavior and security consciousness that persisted long after the immediate threat had been eliminated. The 3 case files Morrison had reviewed represented different types of criminal activity, but all demonstrated the same careful attention to documentation and procedure that had characterized police work in the 1970s. Investigations had been conducted without the technological tools that would later transform law enforcement, relying instead on methodical detective work, community cooperation, and the patient accumulation of evidence through direct observation and witness interviews. The files also revealed the human context within which criminal activity occurred, preserving not just the facts of individual cases, but the broader social and economic conditions that had influenced both criminal behavior and community response. The victims, witnesses, and even the perpetrators documented in these old files had been real people whose lives had been shaped by the events preserved in the official records. As Morrison prepared to return the files to their storage locations, she reflected on the way that archived cases created a form of historical preservation that extended beyond simple law enforcement documentation. The detailed reports, witness statements, and evidence catalogs contained in these files provided future researchers with comprehensive records of daily life in a particular time and place, preserving social history through the lens of official investigation and legal procedure. The basement archive rooms contain thousands of similar files, each one documenting moments when ordinary life had been interrupted by events significant enough to require police attention and official documentation. Collectively, these files created a comprehensive record of urban life that captured not just criminal activity, but the social relationships, economic conditions, and community dynamics that had shaped the city's development over decades of change and growth. Morrison turned off the lights in the archive section and walked slowly through the corridors toward the elevator that would carry her back to the present moment of her evening shift. Behind her, the files waited in climate-controlled silence, their contents preserved against the natural processes of decay that affected all documents eventually. In the morning, researchers, investigators, and administrators would return to continue the ongoing work of law enforcement and community protection, drawing on the accumulated wisdom and experience preserved in the basement archives. The stories contained in the files would remain available for as long as the city maintained its commitment to historical preservation and institutional memory. Future generations of police officers would be able to learn from the investigative techniques, procedural innovations, and community relationships documented in these archived cases, creating continuity between past experience and present challenges that would help ensure the continued effectiveness of law enforcement and community protection efforts. The old courthouse, building occupied an entire city block in the heart of downtown. Its limestone facade weathered by nearly a century of changing seasons and urban evolution. During the daylight hours, the building pulsed with the rhythmic activity of legal proceedings. But in the deep hours of night, it settled into a profound stillness that seemed to amplify every small sound: the distant hum of heating systems, the settling of ancient timbers, the soft whisper of air moving through corridors that had witnessed decades of human drama, played out according to the formal rituals of law and justice. Security guard Thomas Chun had worked the overnight shift at the courthouse for 8 years, and during that time he had developed an intimate familiarity with the building's nocturnal personality. His rounds took him through 5 floors of courtrooms, chambers, and administrative offices, each space carrying its own atmosphere of dignity and solemnity that persisted even when emptied of judges, attorneys, and the citizens whose lives were shaped by the decisions rendered within these walls. The main courtroom on the 3rd floor was Chen's favorite stop during his nightly circuit. Courtroom 312 had been the site of some of the city's most significant trials, including several high-profile criminal cases that had captured public attention and generated newspaper coverage that filled multiple volumes in the courthouse library. The room itself was a masterpiece of early 20th century civic architecture, with high ceilings, tall windows, and carved woodwork that spoke of an era when public buildings were designed to inspire respect for the institutions they housed. Chun paused in the doorway of courtroom 312, allowing his flashlight beam to sweep across the empty gallery where spectators had once crowded during sensational trials. The wooden benches, worn smooth by decades of use, stretched back in orderly rows toward the rear of the room, each one capable of holding 8 people who had come to witness the careful administration of justice. The absence of human presence made the room feel larger somehow, as though the space itself had expanded to fill the void left by missing voices and the subtle sounds of breathing, shifting, and whispered conversation. The judge's bench dominated the front of the courtroom, its elevated position and carved details designed to emphasize the dignity and authority of the judicial process. Behind the bench, the state flag and national flag hung motionless in the still air, their fabric occasionally stirring from air currents that moved through the building's ventilation system. The witness stand, positioned to the right of the judge's bench, retained its atmosphere of solemnity even when empty, as though the thousands of testimonies delivered from that chair had left an invisible residue of human truth and deception that would persist indefinitely. Chun's flashlight illuminated the attorney tables that faced the judge's bench, their polished surfaces reflecting the beam back toward the ceiling in patterns that shifted as he moved through the room. These tables had supported countless legal documents, evidence exhibits, and the personal belongings of lawyers who had spent days or weeks arguing cases that would determine the fates of defendants, victims, and their families. The chairs around the tables maintained their formal arrangement, pushed back from the surfaces as though their occupants had just stepped away temporarily and might return at any moment to resume their advocacy. The jury box occupied the left side of the courtroom, its 12 chairs arranged in 2 rows that had accommodated thousands of citizens over the decades. Chun knew that this particular jury box had been the site of deliberations that had resulted in convictions, acquittals, and the occasional hung jury that had required complete retrial of complex cases. The chairs themselves were upholstered in deep blue fabric that had been replaced several times over the years, but the wooden frames were original to the building's construction and showed the wear patterns created by generations of jurors who had shifted uncomfortably during long testimonies or leaned forward to examine crucial evidence. Moving through the courtroom, Chun's footsteps echoed softly against the marble floors, the sound absorbed partially by the heavy curtains that covered the tall windows along the eastern wall. During day trials, these windows allowed natural light to supplement the courtroom's artificial illumination, creating an atmosphere that connected the formal legal proceedings to the broader life of the city that continued outside. At night, the windows reflected the interior lighting back into the room, creating the impression of a space suspended outside. Normal time and geography. The acoustics of the empty courtroom were remarkable. Designed by architects who had understood the importance of ensuring that every word spoken during legal proceedings could be heard clearly by all participants. Chun's breathing seemed amplified in the silence, and the small sounds created by his movement through the space carried with unusual clarity to every corner of the room. These same acoustic properties had carried the voices of hundreds of judges, thousands of attorneys, and countless witnesses whose testimonies had shaped the legal history of the city. Chun continued his rounds through the adjacent courtrooms, each one maintaining its own character despite sharing the same basic architectural framework. Courtroom 314 had been recently renovated, its modern lighting and updated technology creating a different atmosphere than the more traditional spaces elsewhere in the building. The renovation had preserved the room's essential dignity while incorporating contemporary tools that allowed for more efficient presentation of evidence and more comfortable conditions for extended trials. The holding cells in the building's basement represented a different aspect of the justice system, their utilitarian design reflecting their function as temporary housing for defendants who were awaiting trial or sentencing. Chun's rounds included regular checks of these cells, though they were rarely occupied during overnight hours, except when court schedules required defendants to be held for early morning proceedings. The basement corridor that connected the holding cells stretched the length of the building, its concrete walls painted in institutional green that had been chosen decades earlier and had been refreshed periodically, but never changed to a more contemporary color scheme. Fluorescent lights mounted along the ceiling provided steady illumination that eliminated shadows but created an atmosphere distinctly different from the natural lighting that filled the courtrooms above. Each holding cell was equipped with a narrow bench, a sink, and basic facilities that provided minimal comfort for people who might spend several hours waiting for their cases to be called. The cells were cleaned daily and maintained according to strict health and safety standards, but their primary purpose was containment rather than comfort, and their design reflected the institutional priorities of security and efficiency over aesthetic considerations. Chun paused outside cell number 7, noting how the small space seemed to concentrate the weight of human anxiety and uncertainty that had been experienced by hundreds of defendants who had waited here for their moments of legal reckoning. The cell had been occupied that afternoon by a man awaiting sentencing for a series of property crimes, and though it was now empty and clean, it retained an intangible atmosphere of tension that seemed to linger after its occupants had been moved to other locations. The processing area adjacent to the holding cells contained the administrative infrastructure that supported the building's judicial functions, booking desks, fingerprinting equipment, and communication systems created a functional workspace where the formal procedures of arrest and detention were carried out, according to protocols that had been refined over decades of law enforcement experience. This processing area operated according to rhythms different from those of the courtrooms above, its activities governed by the unpredictable timing of arrests, the availability of transport vehicles, and the scheduling constraints of court calendars had to accommodate dozens of cases simultaneously. During busy periods, the area hummed with constant activity as officers, attorneys, and court personnel moved through the various stages of legal procedure that connected street-level law enforcement to formal judicial proceedings. Chun's flashlight beams swept across the empty processing stations, their computer terminals dark and their desk surfaces clear of the paperwork that accumulated during working hours. The silence in this area felt different from the dignified quiet of the courtrooms, less ceremonial and more purely functional, reflecting the practical necessities of law enforcement rather than the symbolic weight of judicial ritual. The building's administrative offices occupied the second and fourth floors, their layouts designed to facilitate the complex coordination required to manage multiple courtrooms, hundreds of cases, and the scheduling demands of judges, attorneys, and court personnel. Chun's rounds took him through these office areas, past reception desks that would be staffed during business hours and filing, systems that contained the detailed records of thousands of legal proceedings the clerk's office maintained, the official records of all cases processed, through the courthouse, its filing systems representing a comprehensive archive of the city's legal history. During the day, the office bustled with activity as attorneys filed motions, court reporters submitted transcripts, and administrative staff processed the constant flow of documents that legal proceedings generated. At night, the office settled into stillness, its records waiting silently for the next day's activity to resume. Chun paused outside the office of Judge Patricia Morrison, noting how the door's frosted glass panel bore her name in gold lettering that reflected his flashlight beam back into the corridor. Judge Morrison had served on the bench for 15 years, presiding over hundreds of trials and earning a reputation for fairness, thoroughness, and the kind of judicial temperament that inspired confidence in the legal system. Among both legal professionals and ordinary citizens, the judge's chambers behind that door contained law books, legal precedents, and the accumulated wisdom of a career spent interpreting statutes and applying constitutional principles to the specific circumstances of individual cases. During the day, these chambers served as a place of reflection and decision-making where Judge Morrison reviewed evidence, considered arguments, and crafted the rulings that would affect the lives of everyone involved in the cases before her court. The law library on the fourth floor represented the intellectual foundation that supported all of the building's judicial activities. Thousands of volumes lined the shelves, containing statutes, case law, legal commentary, and historical precedents that attorneys and judges consulted to build their arguments and inform their decisions. The library maintained an atmosphere of scholarly contemplation that complemented the more formal dignity of the courtrooms, providing a space where legal research could be conducted with the thoroughness that complex cases demanded. Chun moved through the library stacks, his flashlight illuminating the spines of books that contained centuries of legal thinking and judicial wisdom. Many of these volumes had been consulted during the preparation of cases that had been tried in the building's courtrooms, their contents shaping the arguments and decisions that had determined outcomes in criminal trials, civil disputes, and appeals that had worked their way through the judicial system. The reading tables in the library's center section had supported the research efforts of countless attorneys who had spent long hours preparing for trial, reviewing precedents, and developing legal strategies that might determine their clients' fates. These tables had witnessed intense concentration, collaborative discussion, and the kind of intellectual work that formed the foundation of effective legal advocacy. The building's oldest section, dating to the early 1900s, retained architectural details that reflected the civic idealism of an earlier era. Marble columns, carved moldings, and decorative metalwork created an atmosphere of permanence and dignity that was intended to inspire respect for the institutions of justice and the rule of law. These design elements had been maintained through multiple renovations, preserving the building's historical character while updating its functional capabilities. The main corridor on the second floor stretched nearly 200 feet from the building's front entrance to the rear stairwells, its length punctuated by doorways that led to courtrooms, offices, and conference rooms where the business of law and justice was conducted daily. The corridor's marble floors, installed during the building's original construction, had been worn smooth by decades of foot traffic, but remained structurally sound and aesthetically impressive. Chun's footsteps echoed along this corridor as he continued his rounds, the sound reflecting off the high ceiling and creating an audio environment that seemed to amplify the building's sense of historical continuity. The same floors had supported the footsteps of judges, attorneys, defendants, victims, and witnesses whose interactions had shaped the legal history of the city and contributed to the ongoing evolution of jurisprudence and legal practice. The building security systems required Chun to check multiple access points, alarm panels, and monitoring stations that ensured the integrity of the courthouse and its contents during overnight hours. These security measures protected not just the physical structure and its valuable contents, but the records, evidence, and sensitive documents that represented years of legal work and judicial decision-making. The evidence storage rooms in the basement contained materials from hundreds of cases, each item carefully cataloged and preserved according to strict chain of custody procedures that ensured its admissibility in legal proceedings. These rooms held everything, from documents and photographs to physical objects, that had played crucial roles in criminal investigations and civil disputes. Chun's inspection of the evidence storage area revealed rows of shelves lined with boxes, bags, and containers that held items ranging from routine paperwork to dramatic exhibits that had swayed juries and influenced verdicts. Each piece of evidence represented a fragment of human experience that had been preserved for legal purposes, creating an archive of material culture that reflected the variety of circumstances that brought people into contact with the justice system. The building's elevator system, installed during a renovation in the 1970s, provided access between floors for people with mobility limitations and for the transport of heavy materials and equipment. Chun used the elevators during his rounds, noting how their operation created small sounds that carried through the building's quiet corridors and added to the subtle audio environment that characterized the courthouse during overnight hours. The elevator's brass fixtures and traditional design elements reflected the same commitment to dignity and permanence that characterized the building's overall aesthetic. Even this utilitarian system had been designed and installed with attention to architectural harmony and institutional appropriateness, ensuring that every aspect of the courthouse contributed to its atmosphere of judicial authority and civic responsibility. On the fifth floor, the building's newest addition housed modern courtrooms equipped with contemporary technology for audiovisual presentations, computer-based evidence display, and communication systems that connected the courthouse to other parts of the justice system. These modern facilities represented the ongoing evolution of legal practice and the incorporation of new tools and techniques into traditional judicial processes. The contrast between the building's historical sections and its contemporary additions reflected the challenge of maintaining continuity with legal tradition while adapting to changing technological capabilities and procedural requirements. The architects responsible for the modern sections had worked to preserve the essential character of the courthouse while creating spaces that could accommodate 21st century legal practice. Chun completed his rounds at the building's main entrance, where tall oak doors opened onto the downtown streets that surrounded the courthouse. During the day, these doors admitted hundreds of people who came to participate in legal proceedings, conduct court business, or observe the administration of justice in their community. At night, the doors were locked and secured, but they maintained their symbolic significance as the public gateway to the institution of judicial authority. The entrance hall, with its high ceiling and formal architectural details, created an impressive introduction to the courthouse that was designed to inspire appropriate respect for the legal processes conducted within the building. The hall's marble surfaces, decorative lighting, and carefully proportioned spaces reflected the same civic idealism that had guided the building's original design and construction. Standing in the entrance hall during the quiet hours of his night shift, Chun could sense the weight of history and purpose that gave the courthouse its distinctive atmosphere. The building served not just as a functional workspace for legal professionals, but as a symbol of the community's commitment to the rule of law and the peaceful resolution of disputes through established judicial procedures. The courthouse represented a physical manifestation of abstract principles of justice, democracy, and civic responsibility that formed the foundation of organized society. Its architecture, its procedures, and its daily operations all contributed to a complex institutional culture that had evolved over decades of legal practice and judicial decision-making. As Chun prepared to continue his overnight duties, he reflected on the way that buildings like the courthouse created continuity between past and present, preserving institutional memory and procedural traditions while adapting to changing social conditions and legal requirements. The courthouse would continue to serve its essential functions long after current judges, attorneys, and court personnel had retired, maintaining its role as a center of legal authority and community justice. The empty courtrooms, silent corridors, and darkened offices that Chun patrolled during his night shifts contained the accumulated history of thousands of legal proceedings that had shaped individual lives and influenced the development of legal precedent. These spaces held the memory of dramatic trials, routine hearings, and all the various forms of human conflict and resolution that comprised the daily business of the justice system. In the morning, the courthouse would again fill with the sounds and activities of legal practice, its various spaces resuming their roles in the ongoing work of law and justice. But during the night hours, the building rested in dignified silence, its empty rooms maintaining their readiness to serve the community's need for fair and impartial adjudication of disputes and prosecution of crimes. The courthouse stood as a monument to the principle that justice could be administered through established procedures and institutional structures, rather than through violence or arbitrary exercise of power. Its continued operation represented the community's ongoing commitment to the rule of law and the peaceful resolution of conflicts that inevitably arose in any complex society. Chun locked the main entrance behind him as he concluded his shift, leaving the courthouse to its daytime transformation from a building at rest to an active center of legal proceedings. The cycle would repeat itself each day, the building's spaces serving their essential functions during working hours before returning to the peaceful silence that marked the overnight period between one day's legal business and the next. The morning light filtered through the kitchen windows of the small house on Elm Street, casting familiar patterns across the worn linoleum floor that Mrs. Catherine Walsh had mopped thousands of times during the 37 years she had called this place home. She moved through her routine with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to find comfort in the predictable rhythms of domestic life. But today, her movements carried an extra weight of careful attention, as though she were relearning the geography of spaces that had once felt completely secure. 3 weeks had passed since the burglary that had transformed her home from a sanctuary into a crime scene. 3 weeks since she had returned from her sister's funeral in Buffalo to find her front door standing open and her private world exposed to violation by strangers. The police had been thorough and respectful. Detective Maria Santos had been particularly kind in explaining the investigation process, but their work had necessarily focused on evidence and procedures rather than on the more subtle damage that had been inflicted on Mrs. Walsh's sense of safety and belonging. The physical repairs had been completed within days. Her son Michael had driven down from Albany to help replace the damaged doorframe, install additional locks, and restore the appearance of security that had been shattered along with her peace of mind. The missing items, her mother's jewelry, the small amount of cash she had kept for emergencies, her late husband's watch had been covered by insurance, though no financial compensation could replace the sentimental value that had made those objects irreplaceable. Links to her personal history, but the deeper healing required time and patience that operated according to different schedules than those that governed police investigations or insurance claims. Mrs. Walsh found herself checking and rechecking the locks on her doors, pausing to listen for sounds that might indicate unwelcome presence, and sleeping less soundly than she had in decades. These changes in her daily patterns represented a form of trauma that would never be documented in official reports, but that shaped her experience as significantly as any physical injury. Her neighbor, Mr. James Chun, had taken to walking his dog past her house twice each evening, a routine that had begun casually in the days immediately following the burglary, but that had evolved into an informal security patrol that provided both of them with a sense of mutual watchfulness and community support. Mr. Chun's presence in the neighborhood had become a source of comfort that Mrs. Walsh looked forward to, a reminder that she was not alone in her efforts to restore normalcy to a life that had been disrupted by criminal intrusion. The relationship between Mrs. Walsh and Mr. Chun reflected the kind of quiet community resilience that developed organically in neighborhoods where residents understood their mutual dependence on each other for security, support, and the preservation of the social fabric that made their shared spaces livable. Their informal arrangement required no official coordination or institutional support, but it provided both practical benefits and psychological comfort that enhanced their quality of life in ways that would be difficult to measure or document. Mrs. Walsh's daughter, Jennifer, had begun calling more frequently since the burglary, their telephone conversations extending beyond the routine exchange of family news to include discussions about home security, neighborhood safety, and the various ways that elderly residents could protect themselves while maintaining their independence. These conversations represented a shift in their relationship that reflected Jennifer's growing awareness of her mother's vulnerability and her own desire to provide support and protection from a distance. The burglary had also prompted Mrs. Walsh to reconnect with neighbors she had known casually for years, but with whom she had never developed close relationships. Mrs. Elena Rodriguez, who lived 3 houses down, had stopped by to check on her welfare and had shared her own experiences with home security measures and community watch activities. Their conversation had led to the discovery that they shared similar concerns about neighborhood changes and similar desires to maintain the sense of community that had originally drawn them to the area. These emerging connections between neighbors represented one of the positive outcomes that sometimes develop from negative events, as people recognized their mutual vulnerability and their shared interest in preserving the qualities that made their neighborhood a desirable place to live. The crime that had initially seemed to threaten community cohesion had instead prompted residents to acknowledge their interdependence and to take more active roles in supporting each other's welfare and security. The small business district that served the neighborhood had also been affected by the series of burglaries that had included Mrs. Walsh's home. Store owners had begun coordinating their security measures, sharing information about suspicious activities, and adjusting their hours of operation to ensure that the commercial area remained active and well supervised during the time periods when residential break-ins were most likely to occur. Mr. David Kim, who owned the neighborhood grocery store, had installed additional lighting in the parking area behind his building and had arranged for his employees to vary their arrival and departure times to create less predictable patterns of activity that might make the area less attractive to potential criminals. These measures represented investments in community safety that went beyond his immediate business interests to encompass his role as a neighborhood stakeholder who understood the connections between commercial vitality and residential security. Local elementary school had responded to community concerns about safety by implementing new procedures for after-school activities and by coordinating more closely with police patrol schedules to ensure adequate supervision during the hours when children were walking home or playing in neighborhood parks. Principal Sarah Martinez had worked with parent volunteers to establish informal monitoring networks that provided additional eyes and ears in areas where children congregated. These educational initiatives reflected the way that crime affected entire communities rather than just direct victims, creating ripple effects that influenced the daily routines and decision-making processes of families, businesses, and institutions throughout the affected area. The school's response demonstrated the interconnected nature of community life and the ways that security concerns in one area necessarily affected the operations and priorities of neighboring institutions. Mrs. Walsh's grandson Tommy, age 8, had been staying with her more frequently since the burglary. His visits part of a family strategy to provide companionship and informal security, while helping to restore the sense of normalcy and family connection that had been disrupted by the crime. Tommy's presence in the house created different rhythms of activity and different types of sounds that helped to fill the silence that had begun to feel oppressive to Mrs. Walsh during her solitary hours. The intergenerational aspect of these family visits provided benefits for both grandmother and grandson, as Tommy's natural curiosity about the security measures that had been installed gave Mrs. Walsh opportunities to explain the importance of safety precautions while reassuring him that their home remained a secure and welcoming place. These conversations helped both of them process the emotional impact of the burglary while reinforcing their family bonds and mutual support. The broader family network that surrounded Mrs. Walsh had also adapted to the changed circumstances created by the crime. Her sister Margaret, despite living several states away, had become more involved in daily check-ins and had arranged to visit more frequently to provide practical assistance and emotional support. Her son Michael had restructured his work schedule to allow for more regular visits and had taken on additional responsibilities for home maintenance and security monitoring. These family adaptations represented forms of resilience and mutual care that operated outside official support systems, but that provided essential foundations for recovery and healing. The family's response to the crisis had strengthened their relationships and had created new patterns of communication and support that would persist long after the immediate effects of the crime had faded. The neighborhood's informal communication networks had also evolved in response to the burglary series. Residents had begun sharing information more actively about unusual activities, suspicious individuals, and security concerns that might affect their mutual safety. These communication patterns operated through casual conversations, telephone calls, and chance encounters that created a more robust system of community awareness and mutual protection. Mrs. Rodriguez had organized an informal coffee group that met weekly in her kitchen, bringing together several neighborhood women who had become more conscious of their shared vulnerability and their mutual interest in maintaining community safety. These gatherings provided opportunities for social connection and information sharing while creating a support network that enhanced both individual and collective resilience. The coffee group discussions ranged beyond immediate security concerns to encompass broader questions about aging in place, family relationships, and the various challenges that faced older residents who wanted to maintain their independence while acknowledging their need for community support. These conversations created bonds between neighbors that extended far beyond their shared concerns about crime, prevention to encompass mutual care and Friendship. Mr. Chun's daily dog walks had evolved into a more comprehensive neighborhood monitoring routine that included checking on elderly neighbors, observing unusual activities, and maintaining informal communication with other residents who shared similar concerns about community safety. His efforts had inspired similar activities by other neighbors, creating an overlapping network of informal security patrols that enhanced overall neighborhood watchfulness. The local church, St. Mary's Catholic Church, had responded to community concerns by organizing a parish-based neighborhood watch program that combined practical security measures with spiritual support for residents who had been affected by crime. Father Thomas Murphy had worked with parishioners to create a network of volunteers who could provide assistance to elderly congregants and who could serve as additional sources of community monitoring and mutual aid. The church's involvement in neighborhood security reflected the broader role that religious institutions played in community life, providing not just spiritual guidance but practical support and social cohesion that enhanced residents' ability to cope with challenges and threats. The parish's response demonstrated how established community institutions could adapt their services to address emerging needs while maintaining their core mission of providing spiritual and social support. Mrs. Walsh had begun attending the church's monthly community meetings, finding in these gatherings a sense of purpose and connection that helped to counter the isolation and anxiety that had followed the burglary. Her participation in these meetings represented a form of community engagement that provided both practical benefits and psychological healing while contributing to the collective efforts to maintain neighborhood stability and mutual support. The meetings brought together residents from various backgrounds and circumstances, creating opportunities for cross-cultural communication and mutual understanding that strengthened the social bonds that held the community together. These gatherings demonstrated the way that shared challenges could create bridges between people who might not otherwise have developed close relationships, building social capital that enhanced community resilience and collective problem-solving capacity. The neighborhood's demographic diversity had initially seemed to create barriers to effective communication and cooperation, but the shared experience of security concerns had provided common ground that enabled residents to discover shared values and mutual interests. The crime prevention efforts had revealed strengths and resources within the community that might not have been apparent under normal circumstances. Mrs. Ana Gonzalez, a recent immigrant who lived 2 blocks from Mrs. Walsh, had contributed her experience with community organizing from her home country to help establish more effective communication patterns and mutual support systems among Spanish-speaking residents. Her efforts had created bridges between different cultural groups within the neighborhood and had enhanced the overall effectiveness of community-based security initiatives. The intergenerational aspects of neighborhood life had also been strengthened by the community's response to the burglary series. Older residents like Mrs. Walsh had shared their long-term knowledge of neighborhood patterns and community history with younger families who brought different skills and perspectives to collaborative problem-solving efforts. These exchanges had created mentoring relationships and mutual learning opportunities that enriched community life beyond their immediate crime prevention objectives. The local high school had established a community service program that connected teenage students with elderly neighbors who needed assistance with home maintenance, shopping, and other daily activities. These intergenerational partnerships provided practical support while creating relationships that enhanced both social cohesion and mutual understanding between different age groups within the May community. Tommy's involvement in helping his grandmother adapt to her new security routines had given him a sense of importance and responsibility that contributed to his own development. while providing Mrs. Walsh with assistance and companionship. Their collaboration on safety measures had become a shared project that strengthened their relationship while addressing practical security needs. The economic impact of the burglary series had extended beyond the immediate losses experienced by individual victims to affect local business patterns and property values throughout the affected area. Real estate agents had begun advising potential buyers about security measures and community watch activities, information that had become part of the neighborhood's reputation and marketing profile. Local hardware stores had experienced increased demand for security equipment, locks, and lighting systems, creating modest economic benefits that partially offset some of the negative impacts associated with the crime wave. Store owners had developed expertise in home security consultation, providing advice and products that helped residents improve their protection while supporting local business development. The insurance industry's response to the burglary series had included both individual claim processing and broader risk assessment activities that influenced coverage requirements and premium structures for the entire neighborhood. These institutional responses demonstrated how crime affected community life through multiple channels and systems that extended far beyond direct victim experiences. Mrs. Walsh's insurance adjuster, Robert Kim, had provided not just claim processing services but informal consultation about security improvements and risk reduction strategies that helped her understand how to minimize future vulnerability. His professional expertise had contributed to her recovery process while creating a business relationship that exemplified the positive potential of institutional support for crime victims. The neighborhood's relationship with local law enforcement had evolved through the community's response to the burglary series. Regular patrol schedules had been adjusted to provide more frequent visibility during the time periods when break-ins were most likely to occur, and officers had developed more personal relationships with residents who had become active in community safety efforts. Detective Santos had maintained contact with Mrs. Walsh and other victims beyond the formal requirements of case investigation, providing updates on the overall crime prevention efforts and offering advice about security measures and community resources. These ongoing relationships had helped to build trust and cooperation between police and residents while providing valuable feedback that informed law enforcement strategies and priorities. The community meetings organized by the police department had created forums for ongoing dialogue between law enforcement professionals and neighborhood residents, allowing for the development of collaborative approaches to crime prevention that combined official resources with community knowledge and initiative. These meetings had become regular features of neighborhood life that addressed broader public safety concerns while maintaining focus on the specific issues that had prompted their creation. The healing process that followed the burglary series had revealed both individual resilience and collective strength within the neighborhood community. Residents had discovered resources and capabilities that they might not have recognized under normal circumstances, and they had developed new patterns of mutual support and cooperation that enhanced their quality of life in ways that extended far beyond crime prevention. Mrs. Walsh's recovery from the trauma of burglary had been supported by family relationships, neighborhood connections, and community institutions that had provided multiple layers of assistance and encouragement. Her experience demonstrated how personal healing occurred within social contexts that could either support or hinder recovery, depending on the availability of caring relationships and practical resources. The neighborhood's response to the crime series had created a legacy of enhanced social cohesion and mutual awareness that would persist long after the immediate security concerns had been resolved. The relationships, communication patterns, and support systems that had developed during the crisis had become permanent features of community life that strengthened residents' ability to address future challenges. Collectively, as Mrs. Walsh prepared dinner on this quiet evening, she could hear the familiar sounds of neighborhood life that had gradually regained their comforting quality. Children playing in nearby yards, the distant sound of traffic on the main street, Mr. Chun's footsteps as he walked his dog past her house. These ordinary sounds had been transformed by recent events into symbols of normalcy and community continuity that provided reassurance about her safety and belonging. The kitchen window that had once seemed vulnerable now framed a view of neighbors, houses where people she knew and trusted were going about their evening routines. The sense of isolation that had followed the burglary had been replaced by an awareness of connection and mutual care that made her house feel more secure than it had in years. The crime that had initially threatened her peace of mind had ultimately led to the development of community relationships that enhanced both her safety and her sense of belonging. The quiet evening stretched ahead with the promise of restful sleep and the comfort of knowing that her community had responded to crisis with resilience, compassion, and collective strength that would continue to protect and support all of its members through whatever challenges might arise in the future. The night shift at the Riverside Police Station began each evening at 11 p.m. sharp, marked not by any dramatic ceremony but by the quiet transition of personnel as day shift officers completed their final reports and handed over their responsibilities to colleagues who would maintain the city's protection through the hours of darkness. Sergeant Linda Martinez had supervised this transition for nearly 12 years, and she had developed an appreciation for the unique rhythm and atmosphere that characterized police work during the overnight hours. The main desk area of the station settled into its nighttime configuration as the last of the day shift personnel departed, leaving behind workspaces that would be maintained but not heavily utilized until morning brought the return of full operational tempo. The fluorescent lights that illuminated these areas during peak hours were dimmed to provide adequate visibility while creating a more subdued atmosphere that better suited the contemplative pace of overnight duties. Martinez moved through the station's various departments, checking on the skeleton crew that would handle the night's responsibilities, dispatch operators who maintained communication with patrol units, booking officers who processed arrests that occurred during overnight hours, and the records personnel who continued the never-ending work of filing, cataloging, and maintaining the documentation that preserved the institutional memory of law enforcement activities. The dispatch center occupied the heart of the station, its banks of radio equipment and computer terminals creating a technological nerve center that connected the building's administrative functions to the patrol officers who moved through the city's streets and neighborhoods. During busy evening hours, the dispatch center hummed with constant activity. But as midnight approached, the pace of radio traffic slowed to reflect the city's gradual transition into its quieter nighttime rhythms. Dispatcher Sarah Chen sat at her assigned station, surrounded by the electronic equipment that allowed her to monitor multiple radio frequencies simultaneously while maintaining computer access to databases, mapping systems, and communication networks that supported field operations. Her shift would last until 7 a.m., 8 hours during which she would serve as the crucial link between officers in the field and the resources and support they might need to handle whatever situations developed during their patrols. The steady hum of electronic equipment created a constant background sound that Chun had learned to find comforting rather than distracting. The various machines that surrounded her workstation operated according to their own internal rhythms, their cooling fans cycling on and off, their hard drives spinning up and down, their displays refreshing at intervals that created subtle but regular patterns of light and sound. that marked the passage of time more reliably than the wall clocks that showed the official progression of her shift. The radio traffic that filled Chun's headphones during the early hours of her shift typically involved routine patrol activities, officers checking in from their assigned beats, reporting completion of traffic stops, or requesting backup for domestic disturbance calls that had escalated beyond what single officers could handle safely. These communications followed standardized formats that allowed for efficient exchange of information while maintaining the professional tone that characterized all official police communications. Case File 2024-8847 had been initiated during Chun's shift 3 weeks earlier, when Officer David Rodriguez had radioed for assistance with a burglary in progress at a residential address on Maple Street. Chun had coordinated the response that sent additional patrol units to the scene while maintaining communication with Rodriguez as he secured the area and began his preliminary investigation of the break-in. The paperwork generated by that incident now resided in the filing systems that surrounded Chun's dispatch station, part of the continuous accumulation of documentation that recorded the department's daily activities and created permanent records of every significant event that occurred within the city's jurisdiction. The reports filled out by Rodriguez and the other responding officers had been typed, reviewed, and filed according to procedures that ensured their preservation and accessibility for future reference. Chun remembered the incident clearly because of the unusual circumstances that had surrounded the burglary call. The homeowner, Mrs. Dorothy Patterson, had been awakened by sounds from her kitchen and had observed two individuals removing items from her refrigerator and cabinets. Rather than taking valuables or electronics, the intruders had been stealing food, suggesting motivations different from those that characterized typical residential burglaries. The investigation that followed had revealed that the suspects were two teenagers who had been living on the streets after running away from a group foster home where they had experienced abuse and neglect. Their theft of food rather than valuable merchandise had indicated desperation and hunger rather than criminal intent, motivated by profit or malicious destruction. The case had been resolved through social services intervention rather than criminal prosecution, with the teenagers being placed in more appropriate care situations. The resolution of the food theft case had required coordination between multiple agencies and institutions, generating paperwork that documented not just the criminal investigation, but the social services assessment, family court proceedings, and placement decisions that addressed the underlying problems that had led to the teenagers' criminal behavior. Chun had maintained communication with all of the various professionals involved in the case, ensuring that information was shared appropriately while protecting the confidentiality requirements that governed juvenile cases. The filing cabinets that surrounded Chun's workstation contained hundreds of similar case files, each one representing a moment when someone's life had intersected with the law enforcement system in ways that required official documentation and institutional response. The cases varied in complexity from simple traffic violations that were resolved with written citations to major felony investigations that generated volumes of reports and evidence documentation. Steady accumulation of this paperwork created its own rhythm within the station's overnight operations. Reports were completed, reviewed, and filed according to schedules that operated independently of the immediate urgency that characterized field work. The night shift provided time and quiet that allowed for the kind of careful attention to documentation that ensured the accuracy and completeness of official records. Officer Jennifer Walsh worked the night desk assignment, a position that required her to process arrests, complete booking procedures, and handle the administrative tasks that connected field operations to the station's record-keeping systems. Her workspace was equipped with fingerprinting equipment, photography systems, and computer terminals that allowed her to access databases and maintain the detailed documentation that legal proceedings required. The booking process that Walsh supervised followed procedures that had been refined over decades of law enforcement experience, ensuring that arrested individuals were processed according to constitutional requirements while creating records that would support prosecution efforts and protect both individual rights and public safety. Each step in the booking process generated paperwork that became part of the permanent legal record associated with arrests and criminal charges. The holding cells adjacent to Walsh's workspace were rarely occupied during overnight hours, but they maintained their readiness to accommodate arrestees who might be brought in during the night shift. The cells were cleaned and inspected regularly, their basic facilities maintained according to health and safety standards that reflected both legal requirements and humanitarian considerations. When the cells were occupied, Walsh was responsible for monitoring the welfare of detainees and ensuring that their basic needs were met while they awaited transportation to court facilities or release on bail. This supervisory responsibility required regular checks and documentation that created additional paperwork while ensuring that the department met its legal and ethical obligations to people in its custody. The evidence processing room operated continuously during overnight hours, with technicians cataloging and preserving materials that had been collected during day shift investigations. The work required careful attention to chain of custody procedures that ensured the legal admissibility of evidence while protecting the integrity of materials that might be crucial to successful prosecutions. Evidence technician Robert Kim worked methodically through the evening's accumulation of materials, each item requiring individual documentation, photography, and storage according to protocols that had been developed to meet legal standards and departmental policies. His work generated detailed logs and reports that became part of the case files associated with each investigation. The evidence storage areas contained materials from hundreds of cases, organized according to systems that allowed for quick retrieval while protecting the integrity of items that might not be needed for months or years. The storage systems represented a significant institutional investment in the infrastructure required to support effective law enforcement and successful prosecutions. Kim's overnight shift provided quiet time for the kind of detailed work that evidence processing required, allowing him to focus on accuracy and completeness without the interruptions and urgency that characterized daytime operations. His careful documentation created the foundation for evidence presentation in court proceedings, ensuring that investigative work could be translated into successful prosecutions. The Records Division maintained operations throughout the night shift, with personnel continuing the ongoing work of filing, indexing, and maintaining the documents that preserve the department's institutional memory. The work required attention to detail and understanding of the classification systems that made vast quantities of information accessible to investigators and administrators. Records clerk Maria Rodriguez worked through the evening's accumulation of reports, ensuring that each document was properly filed and indexed according to systems that allowed for efficient retrieval. Her work was essential but often invisible, creating the organizational infrastructure that supported all other departmental operations. The filing systems that Rodriguez maintained contained decades of law enforcement history, organized according to principles that balanced accessibility with security considerations. The records represented not just administrative documents, but historical archives that preserved information about the city's development and the evolution of crime patterns and law enforcement responses. The computer systems that supported the station's operations required continuous monitoring and maintenance during overnight hours, with technical personnel ensuring that databases remained accessible and communication systems functioned properly. The technology that enabled modern law enforcement operations depended on round-the-clock technical support that most personnel took for granted. Asterisk System Administrator David Chun monitored network performance and database operations from his workstation in the station's technical center, responding to system alerts and performing maintenance, tasks that kept the department's information systems operating smoothly. His work was largely invisible to operational personnel, but it was essential to the effectiveness of all departmental activities. The communication systems that connected the station to patrol units, other law enforcement agencies, and emergency services required constant monitoring and occasional adjustment to maintain optimal performance. Chun's technical expertise ensured that these critical systems remained reliable and secure throughout the overnight hours when technical support was minimal and problems needed to be resolved quickly. The station's physical security systems also required monitoring overnight hours, with security personnel checking access controls, alarm systems, and surveillance equipment that protected the building and its contents. The security measures reflected both the valuable equipment and sensitive information housed in the building and the potential threats that law enforcement facilities might face. Security guard Thomas Martinez conducted regular patrols through the building's various departments, checking locks, monitoring alarm panels, and ensuring that security procedures were being followed properly. His rounds took him through areas that were largely unoccupied during overnight hours, but that required continuous protection. The station's overnight atmosphere was distinctly different from its daytime character, with reduced lighting, minimal foot traffic, and the kind of institutional quiet that allowed for focused work on tasks that required concentration and attention to detail. The building seemed to rest during these hours while maintaining its essential functions and readiness to respond to emergencies or unusual situations. The break room that served night shift personnel was equipped with coffee machines, microwave ovens, and comfortable seating that provided respite from the demanding work of law enforcement. The room's atmosphere was informal and collegial, allowing personnel from different departments to interact and share information in ways that enhanced both professional effectiveness and personal relationships. The conversations that occurred in the break room during quiet periods of the night shift often involved sharing experiences, discussing cases, and exchanging information that contributed to the collective knowledge and expertise that characterized experienced law enforcement personnel. These informal interactions created bonds between colleagues and enhanced the department's overall effectiveness. The station's library contained reference materials, training manuals, and legal resources that supported both ongoing education and practical problem-solving for personnel who encountered unfamiliar situations or complex legal questions. The library was used primarily during day shifts, but it remained accessible to night shift personnel who needed to research procedures or legal requirements. The training materials housed in the library reflected the continuous evolution of law enforcement techniques, legal requirements, and professional standards that required ongoing education and skill development. The books and manuals represented institutional investments in personnel development and operational excellence. The station's maintenance systems operated continuously during overnight hours, with heating, cooling, and ventilation equipment, maintaining environmental conditions that protected both personnel and equipment. The building's infrastructure represented significant investment in creating working conditions that supported effective law enforcement operations. Maintenance technician James Wilson monitored building systems from his workstation in the basement mechanical room, responding to alarms and performing routine maintenance tasks that kept the facility operating properly. His work was essential but largely invisible, creating the environmental conditions that everyone else took for granted. The overnight hours at the station created opportunities for equipment maintenance, system upgrades, and facility improvements that would be difficult to accomplish during busy day shift operations. Wilson's shift allowed him to perform tasks that required shutting down systems or accessing areas that were normally in use by operational personnel. The station's fleet of patrol vehicles was maintained during overnight hours, with mechanics performing routine service, repairs, and equipment updates that kept the cars and trucks ready for field operations. The vehicle maintenance area operated according to schedules that minimized disruption to patrol operations, while ensuring that equipment remained reliable and safe. Fleet Maintenance Supervisor Patricia Kim coordinated repair schedules, parts ordering, and equipment installation that supported the department's mobile operations. Her work required technical expertise and logistical planning that ensured patrol units remained available when needed while managing maintenance costs and regulatory compliance requirements. The communications equipment installed in patrol vehicles required regular testing and calibration to ensure reliable operation, particularly for units that operated in areas with challenging terrain or signal interference. The technical requirements for mobile communications systems created additional maintenance responsibilities that were handled during overnight hours. As dawn approached, the night shift personnel began preparing for the transition back to day shift operations, completing final reports, updating status logs, and briefing incoming personnel about overnight developments that might affect daytime activities. The transition was gradual and carefully coordinated to ensure continuity of operations and information sharing between shifts. The paperwork generated during the night shift would be integrated into the department's ongoing record-keeping systems, adding to the accumulated documentation that preserved institutional memory and supported both current operations and future planning. The quiet efficiency of overnight operations contributed to the department's overall effectiveness while maintaining the essential services that protected the community during all hours. The station building settled into its daytime configuration as morning light began to filter through windows that had been dark throughout the overnight hours. The rhythm of police work continued its 24-hour cycle, with each shift contributing to the collective effort that maintained law and order, while serving the community's need for security and justice. The night shift personnel departed quietly, their work completed, but their contributions continuing through the reports they had filed, the cases they had processed, and the maintenance they had performed. The station's overnight operations had maintained essential functions while creating conditions that would support another day of law enforcement activities in service to the community. The photography archive occupied 3 rooms in the basement of the police headquarters, its metal filing cabinets arranged in precise rows that had been undisturbed for months at a time. Chief Archivist Dr. Rebecca Santos had been responsible for this collection for nearly 8 years, during which time she had developed a profound appreciation for the way that photographic evidence evolved from urgent documentation into historical artifact, its immediate relevance gradually replaced by a quieter significance that spoke to the passage of time and the transformation of human memory. Each cabinet contained hundreds of photographs organized chronologically, their black and white surfaces preserving moments that had once demanded immediate attention from detectives, prosecutors, and judges, but that now resided in climate-controlled silence, their dramatic content softened by the gentle process of aging that affected all physical materials eventually. The photographs had been taken by police photographers who had understood their work as evidence collection, but time had transformed their images into something approaching art. Their careful composition and technical precision, creating visual documents that possessed aesthetic qualities beyond their original investigative purpose. Dr. Santos moved through the archive with the measured pace that characterized all of her professional activities, pausing periodically to examine photographs that caught her attention or that illustrated particularly interesting aspects of the collection's historical development. Her work involved not just preservation and cataloging, but also the more interpretive task of understanding how these images functioned as windows into the city's past and the evolution of law enforcement techniques and social conditions. The oldest photographs in the collection dated to the 1940s, their surfaces bearing the distinctive grain structure and tonal qualities that characterized photographic techniques from that era. These images had been shot with large format cameras that required considerable technical skill and careful attention to lighting conditions, creating photographs that possessed a formal quality and compositional sophistication that reflected the professional training of the photographers who had created them. Case file 19472-156 contained 12 photographs documenting a warehouse fire that had been suspected of being deliberately set, though the investigation had never produced sufficient evidence to support arson charges. The photographs showed the building's interior after the fire had been extinguished, with debris and water damage creating abstract patterns of destruction that had been carefully documented by photographer William Chun, whose signature appeared in small script along the bottom margin of each image. The warehouse fire photographs revealed Chun's artistic sensibility as well as his technical competence, with compositions that used the geometric patterns created by fallen timber and twisted metal to create visually compelling images that served both evidentiary and aesthetic purposes. The interplay of light and shadow in the images suggested Chien's understanding of photographic principles that extended beyond simple documentation to encompass the kind of visual storytelling that characterized the best documentary photography. Dr. Santos had researched Chun's background and had discovered that he had worked for the police department for nearly 20 years before retiring to pursue fine art photography, a career transition that reflected his understanding of photography as both technical craft and creative expression. His police work had provided him with opportunities to develop compositional skills and technical expertise that he had later applied to gallery exhibitions and commercial assignments. Martinez's photographs had captured details that provided clues about these hidden aspects of the case, including business documents that had been scattered during the burglary and that revealed financial relationships and commercial arrangements that extended beyond the victim's publicly acknowledged activities. The images served as evidence not just of the burglary itself, but of the broader social and economic networks that had influenced the family's lifestyle and their response to the crime. The 1960s photographs in the collection reflected the social turbulence and cultural changes that had characterized that decade, with images documenting protests, riots, and criminal activities that had been influenced by broader political and social movements. The photographs from this period possessed an energy and immediacy that distinguished them from the more formal images of earlier eras, reflecting both technological improvements in photographic equipment and changes in documentary photography styles. Case file 19675-234 contained 32 photographs documenting a series of arsons that had occurred during civil rights demonstrations. The images capturing both the physical destruction caused by the fires and the social tensions that had motivated the criminal activity. Police photographer Sandra Kim had worked under dangerous conditions to document these scenes, her images revealing both professional courage and technical skill that had preserved important evidence while creating historical documents of lasting significance. Kim's photographs of the arson scenes revealed the complex relationship between criminal activity and political protest, showing how individual acts of violence had emerged from broader social conflicts that had characterized the civil rights era. The images captured not just physical evidence, but atmospheric conditions and contextual details that helped explain the motivations and Circumstances surrounding the criminal acts. Investigation into the arson series had revealed connections between the fires and organized opposition to civil rights activities, though proving legal responsibility for the crimes had proved difficult because of the clandestine nature of the organizations involved and the reluctance of potential witnesses to provide testimony that might have exposed them to retaliation. The case files documented the challenges that law enforcement had faced in investigating politically motivated crimes during periods of significant social unrest. Kim's photographs had provided crucial evidence that had supported some prosecutions while also serving as historical documentation of the physical destruction that had accompanied social conflict. Her images revealed the professional dedication and personal courage that had characterized police photographers who had worked during dangerous and controversial circumstances while maintaining their commitment to accurate and comprehensive documentation. The 1970s photographs reflected technological changes that had made photographic equipment more portable and versatile, allowing crime scene photographers to work more efficiently while producing images of consistently high quality. The photographs from this decade showed increased experimentation with different techniques and approaches, reflecting both improved equipment and enhanced training that had elevated the professional standards of police photography. Case file 1974 to 6891 contained 47 photographs documenting a complex financial fraud investigation that had involved multiple suspects and had required extensive documentation of physical evidence, including documents, computer equipment, and office facilities where the crimes had been planned and executed. Police photographer David Torres had created a comprehensive visual record that had supported successful prosecutions while also preserving detailed information about business practices and technology usage during the mid-1970s. Torres's photographs of the fraud investigation revealed meticulous attention to evidentiary requirements and careful consideration of the visual presentation of complex information, with images that clearly showed document details, equipment configurations, and spatial relationships that had been crucial to understanding how the crimes had been committed. His work demonstrated the evolution of police photography from simple documentation to sophisticated evidence presentation that could support complex legal arguments. Fraud case had involved the systematic theft of funds from a pension plan that had served city employees, creating victims among retirees and workers who had depended on the stolen money for their financial security. The investigation had revealed institutional weaknesses and inadequate oversight procedures that had allowed the theft to continue for several years before being detected and reported to law enforcement. Torres's photographs had documented not just the criminal activity itself, but the organizational structures and procedural failures that had made the fraud possible, creating a visual record that had supported both prosecutions and administrative reforms designed to prevent similar crimes in the future. His images served multiple purposes, functioning as legal evidence, administrative documentation, and historical record of institutional development. The 1980s collection reflected further technological advancement and increased specialization in crime scene photography, with images that showed enhanced technical quality and more sophisticated approaches to visual documentation. The photographs from this period demonstrated the integration of scientific methods and artistic sensibilities that had characterized the professionalization of police photography during the decade. Case file 1983 to 7456 contains 63 photographs documenting a homicide investigation that had required extensive documentation of physical evidence, witness interviews, and crime scene reconstruction activities. Police photographer Maria Rodriguez had created a comprehensive visual narrative that had supported the investigation and prosecution, while also demonstrating advanced techniques in evidence photography and scene documentation. Rodriguez's photographs of the homicide investigation revealed sophisticated understanding of photographic principles and evidence presentation, with images that combine technical excellence with clear visual communication of complex information. Her work showed how crime scene photography had evolved into a specialized discipline that required both artistic skill and scientific precision. Homicide case had involved domestic violence that had escalated into murder, creating an investigation that had required sensitive handling of family relationships and community concerns, while maintaining focus on the evidence needed to support prosecution. The case files revealed the personal and social complexities that had surrounded the crime and had influenced both the investigation and the community response. Rodriguez's photographs had captured not just physical evidence, but atmospheric and contextual details that had helped investigators and prosecutors understand the circumstances surrounding the crime and present their case effectively to judges and juries. Her images demonstrated how skilled crime scene photography could enhance both investigation efficiency and prosecution success. The 1990s photographs reflected the digital revolution that had begun to transform law enforcement documentation. Though most crime scene photography during this period had continued to use traditional film techniques that had provided proven reliability and legal acceptability, the images from this decade showed continued refinement of photographic techniques and enhanced integration with other investigative methods. Case file 1994 to 8123 contained 58 photographs documenting a drug trafficking investigation that had involved surveillance activities, search warrants, and the seizure of large quantities of illegal substances and related evidence. Police photographer Jennifer Walsh had documented all aspects of the investigation, creating visual records that had supported prosecution efforts while also preserving information about drug trafficking methods and law enforcement responses during the early 1990s. Walsh's photographs of the drug investigation revealed advanced technical skills and sophisticated understanding of evidence presentation, with images that clearly showed the scale and complexity of the trafficking operation while providing detailed documentation of specific evidence items that had been crucial to successful prosecution. Her work demonstrated the continued importance of high-quality crime scene photography in supporting complex investigations. The drug trafficking case had revealed connections between local criminal activity and national distribution networks, creating an investigation that had required coordination between multiple law enforcement agencies and had resulted in prosecutions at both state and federal levels. The case files documented the complexity of modern drug enforcement and the challenges that law enforcement had faced in addressing criminal activities that crossed jurisdictional boundaries. Walsh's photographs had provided essential evidence that had supported prosecutions, and it also served as training materials that had helped other investigators understand drug trafficking methods and evidence collection techniques. Her images demonstrated how crime scene photography could contribute to both individual cases and broader law enforcement education and development. Dr. Santos paused in her review of the photographic collection to examine a series of images that had been taken during the early 2000s, when digital photography had begun to supplement traditional film techniques in crime scene documentation. The transition period had created interesting contrasts between different photographic approaches and had required photographers to master new technologies while maintaining established standards for evidence presentation. Case file 200192234 contained both film and digital photographs documenting a complex arson investigation that had involved multiple fire scenes and had required extensive coordination between fire department investigators and police crime scene personnel. Police photographer Robert Kim had used both photographic technologies to create comprehensive documentation that had demonstrated the advantages and limitations of different approaches to evidence photography. Kim's photographs of the arson investigation revealed his ability to adapt traditional photographic skills to new digital technologies while maintaining focus on the evidence needs that had driven crime scene photography throughout its history. His work showed how technological change could enhance investigative capabilities without abandoning proven methods and established professional standards. The arson case had involved insurance fraud that had been motivated by financial difficulties experienced by business owners who had been unable to meet their obligations through legitimate means. The investigation had revealed complex financial relationships and had required detailed analysis of business records and financial transactions that had been documented through both photographic and digital evidence. Kim's photographs had provided crucial visual evidence that had supported prosecution efforts while also serving as examples of best practices in evidence photography. During the transition to digital technologies, his work demonstrated how experienced photographers could contribute to technological development while maintaining focus on the investigative and legal requirements that defined their professional responsibilities. The most recent photographs in the collection reflected fully digital workflows and enhanced integration with computer-based evidence management systems that had transformed crime scene documentation during the past decade. The images showed continued evolution in photographic techniques and equipment while maintaining focus on the accuracy and reliability that had always characterized professional police photography. The photographic archive represented more than just a collection of evidence. It constituted a visual history of the city's development and the evolution of law enforcement methods over several decades. The images preserved information about architectural styles, technology usage, social relationships, and cultural practices that might not have been recorded in any other format, creating historical documentation that extended far beyond their original investigative purposes. Dr. Santos reflected on the way that crime scene photographs functioned as windows into past eras, their documentary value increasing over time as the immediate circumstances that had prompted their creation faded from active memory. The images served as bridges between past and present, allowing current investigators and researchers to understand how previous generations had addressed similar challenges and had developed the methods and procedures that continued to influence contemporary law enforcement. The faded photographs sleeping in their dusty cabinets held stories of human drama, professional dedication, and social change that had shaped the city's development and had contributed to the ongoing evolution of law enforcement as both practical necessity and social institution. Their quiet presence in the climate-controlled archive represented a form of institutional memory that would remain available for future generations of investigators, researchers, and citizens who might want to understand how their community had addressed the challenges of maintaining law and order while protecting individual rights and promoting social justice. As evening settled over the building that housed the photographic archive, Dr. Santos completed her review and prepared to secure the collection for another night of preservation and protection. The photographs would continue their silent vigil, their images waiting patiently for the next researcher or investigator who might need to consult their evidence or learn from their historical insights. The archive represented continuity between past and present, a bridge that connected current law enforcement activities to the accumulated experience and wisdom of previous generations who had faced similar challenges and had developed methods and approaches that continued to influence contemporary practice. The photographs would remain available as long as the community maintained its commitment to preserving institutional memory and learning from historical experience. In the quiet hours of the night shift, when the building settled into its overnight rhythm of minimal activity and careful maintenance, the photographic archive would rest in climate-controlled silence, its contents protected from the natural processes of decay that affected all physical materials eventually. The images would continue their transformation from urgent evidence to historical documentation, their dramatic content gradually softened by the passage of time that transformed all human activity into memory and all immediate concerns into historical perspective.